There is a name that made Roman generals pause before they gave the order to advance. Not a king, not a warlord, not a god with temples and armies. Just a name whispered among the legions in a particular way, the way you whisper something that has no clean explanation. The Druids are here. And that sentence, in the years between the first Roman expeditions to Britain and the final crushing campaigns under Paulinus in 60 CE, carried a weight that standard military intelligence could not account for. Rome had conquered cultures far larger, far more fortified, far better equipped than anything the Celtic islands could assemble. Rome had broken the Macedonian war machine. It had absorbed Egypt, Carthage, Gaul. It had swallowed empires whole and renamed their cities. But Britain lingered. Britain resisted in ways that puzzled the men writing the campaign reports. And when those men tried to explain why, they returned again and again to the same subject. Not the warriors, not the terrain, not the weather. The Druids. This is a story about what they actually were, what they actually did, and what it means that they were destroyed so completely that no one who studied under them left a single written word behind. Every civilization that touched Britain in those centuries, Rome, then the missionary church, then the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms building their new order on top of the rubble, all of them found the Druids to be the single institution worth eliminating before anything else could take hold. That kind of consensus is unusual. It tells you something. Before we go any further, stop for a moment. This is a story about an institution that left nothing in writing by deliberate choice, that held everything it knew in trained living memory across 20 years of careful oral transmission. That choice is what makes the Druids so difficult to understand and so important. Wherever you are right now, whatever the hour is there, you are about to enter one of the oldest and most consequential mysteries this island has ever produced. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Now let's go back to the beginning of what we actually know and what we are still trying to understand. The first written accounts of the Druids come from Greek and Roman sources. This is the foundational problem with everything that follows, because those sources had reasons to describe what they described. They were outsiders, writing for outsider audiences. Julius Caesar, whose Gallic Wars is one of the most detailed accounts we have, was also a military commander justifying a campaign. Posidonius, the Greek philosopher whose lost ethnographic work on the Celts became the basis for most later Roman descriptions, was working from second- and third-hand reports gathered on the fringes of the Celtic world. Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, Tacitus, each of them added details, shaded the account, emphasized what served the argument they were making at the time. And yet something comes through all of it, consistent and strange enough to resist easy dismissal. The Druids were not simply priests. That word, priest, implies a defined institutional role within a religious hierarchy, someone who performs ceremonies on behalf of a community and derives authority from that ceremonial function. The Druids were something more complicated. Caesar describes them as one of the two privileged classes in Gallic and British society, alongside the equites, the warrior nobility. They were judges. They arbitrated disputes between individuals, between tribes, and between kingdoms. Their judgments carried weight that military force could not easily override, because the ultimate sanction they could deploy was excommunication from religious practice. In a society organized entirely around religious practice, in a world where the boundary between daily life and spiritual obligation was not simply porous, but essentially non-existent, that was the heaviest possible weapon. A person, or a tribe excommunicated by Druidic judgment, was cut off from the sacrifice, from the festivals, from the legal and social framework that made collective life possible. Others were forbidden to receive them, to speak with them, to acknowledge their existence in formal terms. It was, in function, a kind of social death that preceded and outweighed physical death, and it was a sanction that no Roman magistrate could replicate because it operated on a frequency the Roman legal system did not have access to. The Romans could execute you. The Druids could make it so that your death meant nothing. This is the first piece of the terror, not the human sacrifice, which the Roman sources describe at length and which modern scholarship has never fully resolved one way or another, not the sacred groves, not the white-robed figures with golden sickles, which is an image Pliny gives us from his natural history and which has burrowed so deeply into popular imagination that it is almost impossible to see past it now. The terror was institutional. The Druids held the legal system. They held the memory system. They held the educational system. They held the interpretive framework through which every event, every political decision, every military campaign was understood by the people living through it. You could kill a Druid. You could not kill what a Druid represented to the society that had spent centuries building itself around Druidic authority. Caesar tells us that Druidic training lasted 20 years. 20 years of oral instruction, because the Druids did not commit their knowledge to writing, a fact Caesar himself notes and offers an interpretation for. He suggests they avoided writing to prevent their knowledge from becoming common, to ensure that the discipline of memory was maintained, to keep outsiders from accessing what they knew. Modern scholars have proposed additional reasons: that oral transmission allowed the tradition to remain living and responsive in ways a fixed written text cannot, that the ritual precision of the learning process itself was part of what the knowledge consisted of, that writing was known and available in the wider Celtic world, but deliberately refused for sacred purposes, the way certain communities today maintain oral traditions, not out of ignorance of literacy, but as a conscious, philosophical and spiritual choice. The result is that everything we know about what Druids actually taught, believed, and practiced comes filtered through people who were not Druids, and in most cases were actively hostile to Druidic culture. This is not a small problem. It is the central problem, and any honest account of the Druids has to sit with it rather than paper over it. We are working with a gap at the center of the record that cannot be filled by inference alone. What we can do is look at the edges. Look at what the external sources agree on. Look at what the archaeological record shows. Look at what comparative mythology and the later Irish and Welsh material, written down by Christian monks centuries after the fact, but drawing on genuinely ancient tradition, can tell us about what this institution once was. The Druids taught philosophy. Caesar says this explicitly. He says they debated the nature of the stars and their movement, the size of the universe and the earth, the order of nature, and the power and might of the immortal gods. This is not the curriculum of a simple priestly caste maintaining local ritual. This is the curriculum of a philosophical school. And the comparison that ancient sources reach for is not to the Egyptian priesthood or the Mesopotamian diviner class. It is to the Greek philosophers. Strabo compares the Druids directly to the philosophers of the Greek tradition. Other writers draw parallels to the Pythagoreans in particular, and this parallel is worth stopping on, because the Pythagoreans were not simply mathematicians. They were a religious and philosophical community, built around the idea of the transmigration of souls, the belief that consciousness does not end with physical death, but passes through successive bodies, accumulating experience, working towards something. Caesar says the Druids believed exactly this. He describes their doctrine of the soul's immortality as their most powerful teaching, the one that made their warriors fearless in battle. Because a warrior who genuinely understands death as a transition rather than an ending fights differently from one who understands death as termination. This is not a small claim. If accurate, and the consistency across multiple independent sources suggests something real underlies it, the Druids had built an entire civilization's relationship with mortality around a philosophical framework sophisticated enough to produce the practical outcome of courage in the face of death. Not the courage of desperation. Not the courage of pride. The courage of people who have thought through the problem of dying and arrived at a position that makes it bearable. The sacred groves were called nemiton. This word survives in place names across the Celtic world. Nemitona was a goddess. The word carries the sense of sacred space, a clearing in the forest where the boundary between ordinary life and the life of the gods was thinner than elsewhere. The Nemiton was the site of judgment, of assembly, of sacrifice, of the great seasonal festivals that organized the Celtic year. And here we enter the territory where the Roman accounts become both most vivid and least reliable, because the sacrifice question is the place where Roman propaganda and genuine ethnographic observation become nearly impossible to separate. Human sacrifice is described in the Roman sources. Strabo mentions wicker figures burned with people inside. Caesar describes similar practices. Tacitus, writing about the Anglesey campaign in 60 CE, describes the Druids standing along the shore as the Roman troops crossed, arms raised, calling down curses, and the torches of the sacred groves burning beyond them. This is one of the most vivid scenes in ancient military literature, and it is written by someone who was not there. Tacitus was born around 56 CE. His source for the Anglesey campaign was almost certainly his father-in-law Agricola, who served in Britain, and the oral tradition that circulated among the officer class about what had happened on Mona, the island the Welsh later called Anglesey, and which the Romans destroyed in that campaign with a thoroughness that suggests genuine ideological commitment, not simply military calculation. The archaeological evidence for human sacrifice in the Celtic world is real: bog bodies. The Lindo man, found in a Cheshire peat bog in 1984. He was a young man, around 25, well-nourished, with manicured nails and what appears to have been a carefully maintained beard. He was killed in what scholars call overkill, a blow to the skull, strangulation, his throat cut, multiple methods simultaneously. This is interpreted as ritual, as deliberate excess of death, as the kind of killing that is not about ending a life efficiently, but about fulfilling a ceremonial requirement. Mistletoe pollen was found in his stomach, and mistletoe was the sacred plant of the Druids, the one Pliny describes being cut with the golden sickle in the ceremony he documents with such theatrical detail. Toland man from Denmark, Grauballer man, the Weirding men. Across the bog landscapes of northern Europe, which in the Iron Age were within the cultural sphere of the Celtic and Germanic peoples who shared certain ritual practices, there are dozens of these carefully preserved sacrificial victims. They do not all show the same patterns. Some were struck once, some were bound and drowned, some appear to have been already dead when they entered the bog. The pattern is consistent enough to point toward ritual, but varied enough to resist a simple, unified interpretation. These were not random killings. They were events of some kind, marking transitions or fulfilling obligations, or addressing crises in ways the communities around them understood and the communities around us can only partially reconstruct. What this means for the Druids specifically is that the Roman claim is probably not pure invention. There was almost certainly some form of human sacrifice within the ceremonial practices of the Celtic world, though whether it was as common, as organized, or as central to Druidic practice as the Roman sources suggest is a different question entirely. The Romans had excellent reasons to emphasize the most lurid possible version of Druidic practice. A civilization that sacrifices human beings in wicker cages is a civilization that a Roman general can claim to be liberating when he crushes it. The framing of Roman conquest as civilizational rescue required a certain kind of barbarian on the other side. But here is what the archaeological record also shows, and what gets less attention than the bog bodies. The Celtic world that the Romans entered in Britain was not a world of isolated tribal societies scratching a living out of marginal land. It was a world of sophisticated agriculture, organized trade, coinage, monumental architecture, and complex social hierarchy. The hill forts, the oppida, the large defended settlements of the late Iron Age were not primitive villages. Maiden Castle in Dorset, Danebury in Hampshire, Cadbury Castle in Somerset. These were real settlements with real economies, real governance structures, real infrastructure. The people inside them were buying wine from the Mediterranean, using imported pottery, engaging in trade networks that extended from Britain to the Danube. This was not the world of desperate savages that Roman propaganda required, and the Druids were not the witch doctors of a primitive people. They were the intellectual class of a sophisticated civilization, one that happened to have made different choices than Rome about which aspects of human experience to develop and which to leave to others. The training of 20 years was not 20 years of memorizing ritual formulas, though that was certainly part of it. Caesar says the Druids were thought to have found this discipline in Britain and that it was still maintained there more rigorously than in Gaul, that students who wanted the most thorough instruction travelled to Britain for it. This is a remarkable detail. It means Britain was understood within the broader Celtic world as the centre of Druidic learning, the place where the tradition was most purely preserved. Gaul had Druids, but for the most serious students, the journey to Britain was the necessary one. This gives Britain a particular status in the Druidic world, the way certain cities hold particular status in the scholarly world today. You could study philosophy in many places in the ancient Mediterranean, but there were centres, and Britain was a centre of this tradition in a way that had no equivalent elsewhere. What were they being trained in for 20 years? The oral texts they memorized are described as being of great length. Julius Caesar says the Druids learn by heart a large number of verses, so many that some spend 20 years in this study. This is not unusual in oral traditions. The Vedic priests of ancient India maintained texts of extraordinary length through oral transmission for centuries before they were committed to writing. The Homeric epics were oral compositions maintained for generations in exactly this way. The Irish Philid, the poet-priests who preserved Irish mythological tradition through the Christian period and eventually wrote it down, were required to memorize hundreds of stories, complex genealogies, the histories of every noble family in Ireland. The feat is not impossible. It is simply different from what literate cultures tend to develop and maintain. What the Druids were memorizing included, almost certainly, the mythological and cosmological narratives that explained the structure of the universe, the genealogies of gods, and the genealogies of the noble families who traced descent from gods, the legal precedents and the philosophical arguments underlying those precedents, the astronomical and calendrical knowledge required to manage the great festivals that organized collective life, the healing knowledge, the botanical and medical lore that modern scholarship has increasingly recognized as containing genuine empirical content, and the poetry, because among the Celts, poetry was not an aesthetic luxury. Poetry was precision technology. The right words spoken in the right way by the right person had effects in the world. This is not metaphor. The satirical poem of a poet druid could destroy a man's reputation so completely that he lost his social standing and sometimes his will to live. The praise poem could establish legitimacy that no military victory could provide. Words had weight in the Celtic world in a way that required training to handle. The connection between the Druids and the management of time is one of the most interesting threads in the archaeological record. The Coligny calendar, found in eastern France in 1897, is the most complete example of a pre-Roman Celtic calendar ever discovered. It is a bronze tablet that survived in fragments, but has been substantially reconstructed. It is a lunisolar calendar, meaning it synchronizes the solar year with the lunar cycle, which is technically demanding because the two cycles do not divide evenly into each other. The Roman calendar was struggling with this problem during Julius Caesar's lifetime, requiring the reform that produced the Julian calendar in 46 BCE. The Coligny calendar appears to predate Roman contact in that region and represents an indigenous Celtic solution to the same astronomical problem. The festivals that this calendar organized are the same ones that appear in the Irish mythological material written down centuries later. Samhain, at the beginning of November, the festival that became Halloween, marking the moment when the barrier between the living and the dead was thinnest. Imbolc in February, associated with the goddess Brigid and the first stirring of the agricultural year. Beltane at the beginning of May, the great fire festival that marked the beginning of summer and the movement of cattle to summer pastures. Lughnasadh in August, the harvest festival named for the god Lugh. These four festivals are found across the Celtic world in various forms. They are built into the landscape of Britain in place names, in the alignment of certain monuments, in the folk practices that survived Christianization and Anglicization and continued into modern times in forms their participants often no longer understood. They organized life. They organized the distribution of resources, the scheduling of legal assemblies, the military campaigning season, the agricultural cycle. Managing them required exactly the kind of specialized astronomical and calendrical knowledge that 20 years of Druidic training would provide. The question of Stonehenge is one that everyone raises when talking about the Druids, and one that requires some care. The popular image of Druids worshipping at Stonehenge is historically very late. It comes from antiquarian movements of the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly from John Aubrey and then William Stukeley, who had no reliable evidence for the association but made it anyway, and it stuck. The actual construction of Stonehenge predates the Druids by more than 2,000 years. The monument was built in phases, beginning around 3000 BCE. The Druids, as a distinct cultural and priestly institution, appear in the record around 3 or 4 centuries BCE at the earliest. There is a gap of roughly 2,500 years between the builders of Stonehenge and the earliest historically attested Druids. What this does not mean is that there is no connection worth examining. It means the connection is not the simple one. The Celtic peoples who arrived in Britain in the centuries before the Roman invasion certainly encountered Stonehenge, certainly had cultural relationships with it, may well have incorporated it into their sacred geography, and used it in ways we cannot directly trace. The Preseli Hills in Wales, where the blue stones of Stonehenge were quarried, remained a sacred landscape in the Celtic period. The orientation of Stonehenge toward the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset connects it to the solar calendar that the Druids managed. Whether the Druids inherited a continuous tradition reaching back to the monument's builders, or whether they reinterpreted and reappropriated a monument they found already ancient and already mysterious, is a question the record cannot answer. Both possibilities are real, neither can be confirmed. What can be said is that the landscape of Britain in the centuries before and during the Druidic period was saturated with monument. The henges, the cursus monuments, those long parallel earthwork corridors of enormous scale whose function modern archaeology has not satisfactorily explained, the long barrows, the standing stones arranged in patterns that, when investigated with the tools of archaeoastronomy, reveal intentional alignments to solstices, equinoxes, and the more complex rising and setting points of the moon across its 19-year metonic cycle. The people who maintained Druidic practice in Britain were not working in an empty landscape. They were working in a landscape that earlier generations had inscribed with meaning, and they were the institution responsible for maintaining the memory of what that meaning was. This is where the intellectual function of the Druids becomes most visible and most important. In a society without literacy, without archives, without the institutional persistence that writing provides, memory is the only technology for transmitting the past into the future. And the past in a monument-inscribed landscape is not an abstraction. It is the ground under your feet, the stones on the hill, the alignment of a corridor that tells you where the sun will rise on the longest day. To maintain the meaning of that landscape requires an institution dedicated to the task. The Druids were that institution. They were, in the most literal possible sense, the living memory of their civilization. This is why their destruction was so total and so specifically targeted. Rome did not generally destroy the religious institutions of conquered peoples. The Roman approach to foreign gods was typically one of integration. You identified the local deity with an appropriate Roman equivalent. You allowed local worship to continue within a framework that acknowledged Roman authority over the administrative and military dimensions of life. This worked in Egypt, in Syria, in North Africa, in most of Gaul. The Druids were the exception. Caesar moved against the Druids in Gaul. The Emperor Tiberius issued an edict against them. Claudius prohibited Druidic practice. The Anglesey campaign under Suetonius Paulinus in 60 CE was not a military campaign in the conventional sense. There was no strategic military objective on Anglesey. The island was not a threat to Roman supply lines or to the security of the province. It was a sanctuary. It was the place where the tradition had retreated as Roman power consolidated across the lowland south and midlands of Britain. Tacitus describes it explicitly as a refuge for the common people and a source of inspiration for resistance, which is his way of saying that it was the place where the ideological infrastructure of resistance was being maintained. The Anglesey campaign destroyed the sacred groves. Tacitus describes this with a specificity that suggests real information behind it. The groves were sacred, not simply as aesthetically pleasant natural spaces, but as functioning institutions. They were the libraries, the archives, the law courts, and the ceremonial centers of Druidic practice. To destroy the groves was to destroy the physical infrastructure within which Druidic authority operated. Combined with the killing of the practitioners and the prohibition on the practice, the effect was the systematic dismantling of an institution that had been the organizing principle of British cultural life for centuries. And then it was gone. Not reduced, not transformed into something that could survive under a new name or within a new structure. Gone. The Roman sources note the Druids after Anglesey only in the context of Gaul, in occasional references that become increasingly sparse. By the 3rd century CE, the word Druid in the Latin sources is attached to figures who are clearly something quite different from the institution Caesar described. An old woman in Gaul who calls herself a Druidess and tells a soldier his campaign will fail. A reference to the descendants of Druids as innkeepers. The institutional structure had ceased to exist, and what remained was a word attached to residual figures who claimed some connection to a tradition that was already becoming legend within living memory of its destruction. Britain, by contrast, falls into a kind of silence on the Druidic question that is itself informative. The Romano-British archaeological record from the period after the Boudiccan revolt and the consolidation of Roman control in the late 1st century CE shows something interesting. The indigenous religious landscape does not disappear entirely, but it is systematically remade. Sacred springs gain Roman structure. The native goddess is paired with a Roman one. The hill forts are abandoned or transformed. The nemeton, the sacred grove spaces, are not typically built over or converted. They are left. There is evidence at some sites that they continued to attract some form of activity, but the organized institutional presence that once centered there had been removed. The question of what happened to the knowledge is the one that lingers. 20 years of oral training, the astronomical knowledge, the legal traditions, the philosophy of the soul, the memorized narratives that encoded a civilization's understanding of itself and its relationship to the cosmos. Where did it go? Some of it went west and north. Ireland was never conquered by Rome. The Atlantic seaboard of Scotland was never fully absorbed. These were the regions where the Celtic cultural tradition maintained the greatest continuity, and it is from these regions that the later written records, the Irish mythological cycle, the Welsh material in the Mabinogion, and the related texts, the poetry and the law tracts, emerged when Christian monks began writing things down in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries. These written texts are not Druidic texts. The monks who wrote them were operating within a Christian framework, and they filtered the material they preserved through that framework, suppressing what seemed most directly offensive and transforming what remained in ways that sometimes obscure and sometimes accidentally preserve the older structure underneath. But the persistence of Druidic figures in the Irish material is unmistakable. The Fillid, the poet class of early medieval Ireland, maintained a social and legal status that looks remarkably similar to what Caesar describes for the Druids in Gaul and Britain. They were exempt from military service. They could move freely between kingdoms that were otherwise at war. Their satirical and praise poetry had legal force. They claimed genealogical connection to divine figures and maintained that connection through elaborate training programs that lasted, depending on the source, anywhere from 12 to 20 years. The Irish sources use the word drui for figures in the mythological material. These figures are not simply priests. They are advisors to kings, prophets, weather workers, boundary setters, possessors of knowledge that operates on a different order from ordinary human knowledge. The wizard figure in Irish mythology is not derived from the Roman or Christian tradition. It is the older figure, the Druid, maintaining a presence in the narrative record because the institution was still functioning in Ireland when the material was first being organized, and then persisting in the written record because it had been organized in that form before. Christianity had fully reshaped the cultural landscape of the island. In Wales, the figure of Merlin, one of the most famous characters in all of medieval European literature, has deep Celtic roots that have been extensively analysed. Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century Historia Regum Britanniae, which is the source for most of the Arthurian tradition as medieval Europe knew it, draws on Welsh and possibly Breton material that is itself drawing on older tradition. The Merlin figure, the wild man of the woods, the prophet and advisor to kings, the figure who operates outside normal political structures but whose authority shapes them, is recognizably a late echo of the Druidic type, not a direct survival. The institution was gone, but the cultural template for what that kind of figure looked like, what role it played, what authority it claimed, persisted in the literary tradition long after the institution itself had been destroyed. This is one of the most haunting aspects of the whole story. Institutions die. The knowledge they contain does not always die with them. It disperses, fragments, goes underground, surfaces in different forms in different contexts. Some of it finds its way into the work of people who do not know exactly where it came from, who handle it as part of a tradition they inherited rather than a tradition they understand. The later Celtic material is full of astronomical knowledge, legal philosophy, and narrative cosmology that looks, to scholars who study it carefully, like the residue of something much older and much more systematically organized than what survives. The Pythagorean parallel that the ancient sources drew is worth returning to here, because the Pythagoreans had a similar trajectory. The school was destroyed, its founder killed, its members dispersed, its texts burned. What survived entered the broader philosophical tradition in fragments, often unacknowledged, often in forms that had been reshaped by later contexts. The doctrine of the transmigration of souls, which Caesar explicitly attributes to the Druids, survived in the broader Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition in ways that make tracing its Celtic contribution almost impossible. When Neoplatonism appears in early Christian mysticism, when the doctrine of purgatory develops in the medieval church in ways that echo something much older than Orthodox Christianity, when the Gaelic and Welsh literary tradition maintains a relationship with the otherworld, the realm of the dead, that is distinctly non-Roman in its structure, you are looking at dispersed fragments of a tradition whose original organizing institution is gone. The specific question of what the Druids believed about the soul and what happens to it after death is one where the ancient sources are both most emphatic and least detailed. Caesar's statement is clear but brief. The Druids believe that souls do not perish but after death pass from one person to another. He connects this directly to the military courage of the Gauls and Britons, saying it makes them fearless in battle because it takes away the fear of death. Diodorus Siculus says something similar, adding that this is why the Celts throw letters into funeral pyres, believing the dead will be able to read them in the other world, a detail that is either a misunderstanding or a genuine survival of practice, but, in either case, suggests a belief in the continuity of personal identity through death. The Welsh and Irish mythological material is full of journeys to the other world, a place called, in Irish, the Tir na Nog, the land of the young, or the Tir Tainn Gir, the land of promise, or many other names, depending on the context. Because the Celtic otherworld is not a single place but a category of experience, a dimension adjacent to ordinary reality that interpenetrates it at certain points and at certain times, this is structurally different from the Greek underworld, which is emphatically the place of the dead, separated from the living by the river Styx, and by the fundamental ontological difference between existence and non-existence. The Celtic otherworld is not the realm of the dead in that sense. It is the realm of the gods and the dead together, a place where time moves differently, where the laws of ordinary reality are suspended, and where returning travelers bring back knowledge or gifts or changes that feed back into the ordinary world. This cosmological structure, the permeable boundary between the living world and another order of reality, the figure who can cross that boundary and return, the emphasis on the continuity of identity through apparently terminal transitions, is consistent with what Caesar attributes to the Druids. It suggests that what he is describing is not simply a folk belief, but a philosophical system sophisticated enough to have generated a cosmological framework that organized the entire symbolic landscape of the culture, including its mythology, its ritual calendar, its treatment of the dead, and its understanding of what heroism consists in. The treatment of the dead in the pre-Roman Iron Age of Britain is archaeologically visible in ways that add texture to the philosophical picture. The tradition of inhumation, of burying the dead with carefully selected grave goods, persists across this period with regional variation and change over time, but with consistent attention to the dead person's identity and continued needs. The chariot burials of the Yorkshire Wolds, the Arras culture tradition, in which individuals of high status were buried with their chariots, their horses, sometimes with food and drink, and objects of personal significance, represent an enormous investment of material and labor in the transition of a person from one form of existence to another. This is not the behavior of a culture that believes death is the end. The investment makes sense only if the people making it believe that what they are sending with the dead will be received and used. The specific connection between the Druids and the management of death, not simply the performance of funerary rites, but the philosophical framework within which those rites were understood, gives them an authority in the culture that goes beyond what any purely ceremonial function could provide. They were the people who had thought most carefully about the question everyone most feared. They were the institution that had, through decades of training and accumulated tradition, worked out the best available answers to that question and transmitted those answers in a form that the culture as a whole could use. That is extraordinary power. It is the kind of power that does not depend on military force or economic control. It operates on a level that military force and economic control cannot directly reach, which is exactly why Rome, which had excellent tools for dealing with military force and economic control, found the Druids uniquely difficult to manage. The Boudiccan Revolt of 60 CE is the context within which the Anglesey campaign must be understood, because the two events overlap in ways that are not accidental. Suetonius Paulinus was in the middle of the Anglesey campaign when the revolt broke out in the east. The revolt was led by Boudica of the Iceni following the Roman annexation of Iceni territory and the flogging of Boudica herself and the assault on her daughters that accompanied it. The revolt was catastrophic for Rome in its initial phase. Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium were burned. Roman casualties were massive. The rebellion drew in not just the Iceni, but the Trinovantes and other peoples who had accumulated grievances against Roman administration. Paulinus marched his forces back from the west to deal with it. He won the final battle, the location of which is still debated. The revolt was crushed. Boudica died. And the period of Roman dominance in Britain that followed was more settled, more assimilated, more genuinely Romano-British in character than what had preceded it. The province was being rebuilt on a new model, one in which the indigenous elite could participate in Roman administrative structures, in which urban centres could develop on Roman lines, in which the indigenous religious landscape was accommodated within a Roman framework rather than directly confronted. But the Druids were not part of this accommodation. The distinction is important. Rome was not anti-Celtic. It was anti-Druid. The warrior nobility could be absorbed into the Roman military and administrative structure. The ordinary population could be taxed and administered like any other provincial population. The religious traditions could be syncretized. What could not be accommodated was the Druids, because the Druids were not simply the religious specialists of a particular culture. They were the institution that maintained the alternative authority structure, the alternative legal system, the alternative memory system. As long as the Druids existed, there was a competing framework within which Roman authority was not simply illegitimate, but was understood as a disruption of a more fundamental cosmic order. That kind of competition could not be managed by integration. It could only be ended. The burning of the groves on Anglesey is Tacitus at his most deliberately literary. He describes the spectacle of the Druids and their supporters gathered on the shore. He describes the Roman soldiers frozen for a moment by the sight of the women in black with disordered hair like furies. He describes the Druids lifting their hands toward the sky and calling down curses. And then the Roman commander speaks. The soldiers remember their discipline, and they advance. The groves are cut down. The altars are destroyed. The fires that burn are not the ritual fires of Druidic practice, but the fires of military destruction. What Tacitus is describing, in his carefully literary way, is the end of something. He knows it is the end of something, even as he describes it approvingly as the conquest of superstition by reason and discipline. The Roman world had a category for what the Druids represented: superstitio, the word that applied to any religious practice that operated outside the framework the Roman state recognized and controlled. Superstitio was not simply wrong belief. It was dangerous belief that organized people around a non-Roman authority. The Druids were, in Roman legal and cultural terms, the defining case of superstitio, which is why the legislative campaign against them began decades before the military campaign reached Anglesey. But the burning of the groves was not the last moment. It was the institutional end. But the knowledge does not end at the institutional moment. The people who had been in training for 20 years, who had spent decades memorizing the tradition, who had the cosmological framework of the culture in their heads, those people were still alive, at least some of them, after Anglesey. They scattered. They went where Rome was not, or where Rome was thinner, or where the institutional structure of Roman administration did not reach into the practice of daily life with the same density that it reached into the lowland urban centres. They went to the hills, to the islands, to the north and west, to the places where the Roman grip was a frontier grip rather than a consolidated administrative one. And they continued, for a generation, perhaps two, passing on what they could to whoever would listen, knowing that the structure that had sustained the tradition for centuries was gone, and that what remained was fragments. The fragments are what we have, and the fragments are enough to tell us that what was lost was real, was large, was sophisticated in ways that the dismissive Roman framing of Druidic practice as superstition cannot accommodate. The astronomical knowledge, the philosophical framework, the legal system, built on principles of honor and obligation and the continuity of identity through time. The poetry that was not decoration, but precision instrument. The training system that produced individuals capable of holding a civilization's memory in their minds across 20 years of careful formation. These things existed. They were organized and transmitted through a specific institution. And when that institution was dismantled, they dispersed into the larger cultural inheritance of the British Isles in forms that we are still working to identify and understand. The Irish material gives us the most sustained access to what the tradition once contained. Ireland's position outside the Roman sphere meant that the process of cultural transmission from the pre-Roman Celtic world to the medieval period happened there without the interruption that Roman conquest imposed on Britain and Gaul. The tradition was transformed. The Christian monastic environment that produced the written texts was not neutral. The monks who wrote down the mythology were not Druids, were not sympathetic to Druidic practice, were, in some cases, actively engaged in the project of converting a culture that still remembered a different framework. But the material they preserved, for whatever reasons of literary interest or antiquarian concern or simple cultural persistence, contains structures that point backward to an older order. The concept of the sacred king in Irish mythology and lore, the king whose personal condition was understood to be directly linked to the condition of the land, whose transgression of ceremonial prohibitions, called giesa, brought disaster not just to himself but to his territory, whose proper performance of the ritual partnership with the sovereignty goddess ensured fertility and prosperity. This concept is not a Christian idea. It is not a Roman idea. It is a specifically Celtic idea, with parallels in other archaic Indo-European traditions that suggests a very old common inheritance. The Druids were the specialists who managed this system, who identified the prohibitions, who performed the rituals, who interpreted the signs that indicated whether the king's relationship with the land was in proper order. Without the Druids, the system could not be maintained in its original form. But the ideas underlying it persisted in the mythology and the lore tracts and the poetry long after the institutional specialists who had once managed them were gone. The Welsh material is more filtered, more deeply transformed by the centuries of contact with Romano-British culture and then with the Anglicizing pressures that followed, but it preserves things too. The Mabinogion, the collection of Welsh tales written down in the 12th and 13th centuries, contains material whose mythological structure clearly predates the medieval period. Pryderi, Rhiannon, Pwyll, the journey to Annwn. These names and these stories carry the bones of something older in their structure, a cosmological framework in which the ordinary world and the other world are in constant relationship, in which individuals can cross the boundary under certain conditions, in which the knowledge brought back from the crossing is real knowledge that has real effects. This is the Druidic framework, surviving in literary form long after the institution that originally organized and transmitted it had ceased to exist. The tradition of the bard, which survives in Wales with extraordinary persistence, maintaining formal competitions and institutional recognition into the modern period through the Eisteddfod Fod, is a late echo of the bardic class that was part of the broader Druidic institution in the ancient period. Caesar and others distinguish between the Druids proper and the bards, the latter being the specialists in poetry and song, who performed the praise and satirical poetry and maintained the genealogical tradition in sung form. The bards survived the destruction of the Druidic institution, both because their function was somewhat more separable from the specifically ceremonial and judicial functions of the Druids, and because poetry and song could persist in a way that the living oral transmission of legal and cosmological knowledge could not, without the formal institutional structure that supported it. The bards of medieval Wales were not Druids, but they were working within a tradition that Druidic culture had shaped, and some of what they preserved in their poetry carries traces of the older framework in ways that scholarship has been gradually identifying. The question of what the Druids knew about the natural world is one where the fragmentary record is suggestive in interesting ways. The association of the Druids with particular plants is not simply the romantic invention of later tradition. Mistletoe, the plant, Pliny describes the Druids cutting from the oak tree with a golden sickle in a ceremony involving white bulls and a precise ritual timing, appears in the later folk medical tradition of the British Isles and Ireland with a consistency that suggests genuine indigenous medical knowledge at its root. Mistletoe has real pharmacological properties. It is genuinely bioactive in ways that modern pharmacology has confirmed, containing compounds with demonstrable effects on blood pressure, immune function, and cellular regulation. Whether the Druids knew this in the terms modern pharmacology would use is obviously not the question. Whether they had organized knowledge about the plant's effects, transmitted through the training system in the form of memorized doctrine about its applications and its ritual significance, is a more interesting question, and one that the later folk tradition suggests an affirmative answer to. The healing function attributed to the Druids in later tradition is not simply the healing function of any traditional culture. It appears in the sources as specialized knowledge of a particular order, connected to both the pharmacological knowledge of plants and the philosophical knowledge of the soul and its relationship to the body. The Irish Bandrui, the female druid, appears in the mythological material specifically in connection with healing, with prophecy, and with the management of transitions, birth, death, passage from one state to another. This is not the profile of a simple herbalist. It is the profile of a specialist in the philosophy of change, someone whose knowledge of plants is embedded in a larger framework about what the body is and what the soul is and how they relate to each other. Strabo mentions the three classes of Celtic specialists: the bards, the vates or seers, and the druids, with the druids being specifically associated with philosophy and natural knowledge in addition to the judicial and ceremonial functions. The vates are the diviners, the people who read signs in the natural world and interpret them for the community. This separation of functions within what the Roman sources sometimes lump together under the single category of druid is actually quite informative. It suggests a differentiated institution with internal specialization, something more like a university with different faculties than like a single undifferentiated priestly class. The 20 years of training was not 20 years of the same curriculum for everyone. It was probably a structured progression through different levels of knowledge, with individuals finding their particular calling within the larger institution. The figure of the druid as judge, as the person who arbitrated disputes and whose decisions had binding force across tribal boundaries, is one of the most important aspects of the institution that gets lost in the popular image of the white-robed mystic in the grove. The Druids were the legal institution of the Celtic world, and Celtic law, which survives in fragmentary form in the Irish and Welsh legal texts, was not primitive. It was elaborate. It was built on a sophisticated understanding of social obligations, of honor and its gradations, of the relative weight of different kinds of testimony, of the proper compensation for different kinds of harm. It had provisions for women's property rights that were not exceeded in English law until the 19th century. It had procedures for the peaceful resolution of disputes between neighboring kingdoms that are recognizably sophisticated in the same sense that modern international law is sophisticated. And it was maintained without written texts, without a bureaucratic apparatus, without a state in the modern sense. It was maintained by the Druids, who had memorized it, who understood its principles, who could apply it to novel situations because they had internalized not just the rules but the philosophical framework underlying the rules. When the Druids were gone, the legal tradition went with them in the places where Roman law replaced it. It persisted in Ireland, where the Brehon law, the indigenous legal tradition, continued to function alongside and eventually in tension with the canon law of the Church, and later with English common law, until the Elizabethan conquest of Ireland in the late 16th and early 17th centuries finally broke the remaining institutional structures through which it was maintained. The Brehon law texts that survive from the medieval period are written in a legal language so archaic that even medieval Irish scholars found it difficult. This conservatism, this deliberate preservation of archaic forms, is itself evidence of the institutional pressure to maintain the tradition exactly as it had been received. It is the same conservatism that maintained the Vedic texts in exactly the form in which they had been transmitted, a conservatism that is the mark of an oral tradition that has learned what happens when you change the words. The connection to the land in Druidic thought goes deeper than the management of agricultural festivals. The Nemeton, the sacred grove, was not simply a convenient outdoor ceremonial space. It was a particular kind of place, chosen for specific qualities, the meeting point of something that the Celtic world recognized as sacred and that we have difficulty naming in the vocabulary available to us. The oak was the primary sacred tree, and the Druids are named from a root that appears in Celtic languages in connection with the oak, dar, in Old Irish. Dare. The connection between the name and the tree may be the first thing said about the Druids in the entire scholarly record, though there is disagreement about the etymology. If the name connects to the oak, and through the oak to the quality of wisdom or strength or durability that the oak represented in the Celtic symbolic system, then the name itself is an institutional description. The people of the oak. The people of the deep knowledge, because the other proposed root, connected to the Proto-Indo-European word for knowing or seeing, gives you the Druid as the one who sees deeply, the one whose vision penetrates the surface of things. Either etymology, or both, describe an institution built around a particular relationship to a particular kind of knowledge, knowledge that is deep, durable, connected to the most ancient and rooted things in the natural world, knowledge that requires time and commitment and initiation to access. This is not the profile of a system designed for rapid transmission or wide distribution. It is the profile of a system designed to maintain quality over quantity, to ensure that what it transmits is transmitted correctly, even if that means it can only be transmitted to a limited number of people in any generation. The oak grows slowly. The knowledge that takes 20 years to transmit grows slowly too, and that slowness is not a deficiency. It is a design feature. The relationship between the Druids and the astronomy of the British Isles is a subject that has been progressively clarified by the work of archaeoastronomers over the past several decades. The monument landscape of Britain and Ireland is not simply old, it is oriented. The long barrows of Neolithic Britain are oriented towards specific celestial events, with a consistency that has been statistically demonstrated to be beyond coincidence. The stone circles of the Bronze Age show alignments to solstices, equinoxes, and lunar standstills. The cursus monuments, those enormous parallel earthwork enclosures whose function remains genuinely puzzling, are oriented in ways that, when analyzed against the local astronomical horizon, reveal deliberate attention to the rising and setting points of celestial bodies. This monument landscape was ancient by the time the Druids arrived at their historical period, somewhere in the first millennium BCE. But the knowledge, encoded in its construction, the understanding of the sky and its patterns that made the alignments possible, that knowledge had to go somewhere when the building stopped. Knowledge of celestial patterns is not self-maintaining. Without an institutional commitment to observing, recording, transmitting, and applying it, it dissipates within a few generations. The Druids were the most likely institutional home for the inherited astronomical tradition of the British Isles in the period before Roman conquest, and the 20-year curriculum that Caesar describes as including debate about the stars and their movement is consistent with the maintenance of exactly that kind of specialized observational knowledge. The practical applications of astronomical knowledge in a non-literate agricultural society are numerous and important. The management of the agricultural calendar, the timing of planting and harvest, the prediction of seasonal floods, the identification of the optimal time for specific agricultural operations, all of these benefit from precise astronomical knowledge transmitted across multiple generations. The timing of the great festivals that organize social and legal life similarly required astronomical precision. Samhain is not simply the 1st of November in the Roman calendar. It is the festival of the cross-quarter day between the autumnal equinox and the winter solstice, a point in the solar year that requires careful observation to identify precisely. The same is true for Imbolc, Beltane, and Lughnasadh. Managing these festivals required knowing where they fell in the solar year, which required the kind of accumulated observational tradition that a trained institution could maintain, but an untrained community could not. There is a specific piece of astronomical knowledge attributed to the Druids in the ancient sources that is worth examining carefully. Strabo reports that the Druids claimed the land and the sea were inundated periodically, a cyclical pattern of catastrophe. This is an unusual claim to preserve in an ethnographic account, and its persistence suggests it was a genuine element of Druidic cosmological teaching. The idea of periodic flooding, of a great cycle of the world's ages, in which catastrophic transitions between one era and the next are marked by rising water, appears in mythological traditions from across the ancient world. The Greek myths of the Deucalionic flood, the Mesopotamian flood narratives, the biblical account of Noah, various Hindu traditions of the world's periodic destruction and renewal. What the Druids apparently maintained was a British Celtic version of this widespread mythological framework, connected to astronomical cycles of sufficient length to encompass the observable geological record of sea level change. The British Isles were dramatically transformed by rising sea levels in the period from roughly 12,000 to 6,000 years before the Common Era. The land bridge that connected Britain to continental Europe, known now as Doggerland, was progressively inundated as the glaciers melted and sea levels rose, reaching approximately the current configuration around 6,000 years ago. This is within the range of cultural memory for peoples who maintained oral tradition across multiple generations. The folk memory of the drowned land, transmitted through the institutional memory of the Druidic tradition, may be what Strabo's informants were describing as the Druidic doctrine of periodic inundation. This would be an example of the oral tradition preserving genuine geological history in mythological form, the same phenomenon that scholars studying Polynesian oral tradition and Aboriginal Australian oral tradition have documented for similar landscape changes in those regions. The specificity of the British situation, the loss of Doggerland, the transformation of a substantial inhabited plain into the North Sea is the kind of catastrophe that a tradition would preserve. The people who lived on Doggerland were the ancestors of the populations who later inhabited Britain and Ireland. Their disappearance was not a distant foreign event. It was the disappearance of the land of the ancestors, the transformation of the world that preceded the current world into something that could only be accessed in memory and in the traditions that kept that memory alive. The Druids, as the institutional memory of the culture, would be the most natural repositories for that kind of long-duration knowledge, and the Druidic doctrine of periodic inundation, however distorted in its transmission through Strabo, may be a trace of exactly that. The connection between the Druids and the concept of sovereignty is another thread worth following. In Celtic political philosophy, the legitimacy of a king depended not simply on descent or military power, but on his relationship with the land and with the divine powers that animated it. The goddess of sovereignty, who appears in Irish mythology in many forms, the most famous being perhaps the figure of the Morrigan or the various shape-shifting women who test the worthiness of potential kings, embodied the land's own will about who should rule it. The Druidic institution was the interpreter of that will. The rituals through which a king was inaugurated were Druidic rituals. The signs that indicated whether a king had the favour of the sovereignty goddess were Druidic interpretations. The judgments about whether a king's transgressions of the sacred prohibitions that governed his conduct had brought disaster on his people were Druidic judgments. This function gave the Druids a specific kind of power over political authority that is difficult to parallel in other institutional contexts. They did not rule. The warrior nobility ruled in the sense of exercising physical and administrative control over territory. But the Druids determined whether that rule was legitimate in a sense that the society understood as more fundamental than simple power. A king who had lost Druidic sanction was a king whose authority rested on nothing but force, and force alone was not enough to maintain political order in the Celtic world. The elaborate system of obligations, hospitality rules, tribute arrangements, and ceremonial relationships that held the political structure together required constant maintenance by individuals who understood both the practical and the sacred dimensions of those relationships. The Druids understood both. When Rome removed the Druids, it removed this legitimizing function from the Celtic political structure of Britain. What remained was political authority that could only justify itself in Roman terms, which meant that indigenous leaders who continued to exercise authority had to do so within a Roman framework, acknowledging Roman superiority as the source of their legitimacy. The warrior nobility could make this accommodation. The Druids, by definition, could not. The Druidic framework held that sovereignty came from the land and the divine powers associated with it, filtered through the institutional knowledge of the Druidic class. The Roman framework held that sovereignty came from Rome. These were not compatible positions, and there was no middle ground where both could coexist. One had to go. Rome ensured it was the Druids. The specific geography of Druidic Britain adds another dimension to the story. Britain is an island. The sea that surrounds it was not simply a geographic feature in the Celtic imagination. It was a cosmological boundary, the edge of the ordinary world and the threshold of the other world. The Atlantic Ocean, which opens out to the west beyond the western edge of Britain and Ireland, was the place where the sun went when it set, the direction of the otherworld in Celtic geography. The Western Islands, real islands like Anglesey, like the Outer Hebrides, like Arran and Skellig Michael off the coast of Ireland, and legendary islands like Tir na Nog, were understood as places where the boundary between the ordinary world and the other world was thinnest. This geography made Britain, and particularly the western and northern extremities of Britain, special in the Druidic cosmological framework. The island itself was at the edge of the known world in the classical geographic imagination. Caesar remarks that Britain was thought to be at the limit of the inhabited earth. This position, on the threshold between the known and the unknown, between the ordinary world and what lay beyond it, made Britain a natural location for the kind of deep initiation into the knowledge of the other world that the Druidic training program entailed. To go to Britain for Druidic training was to go to the edge of the world for the knowledge that the edge of the world could provide. This is why students came from Gaul, from across the Celtic world, for the British initiation. The institution was located where it was supposed to be located, according to the cosmological framework within which it operated. The sacred springs of Britain carry particular significance in this context. There are hundreds of sacred spring sites known from the Roman and pre-Roman period in Britain, places where water emerges from the earth and which were associated with healing, with prophecy, with the ability to cross the boundary between the ordinary world and the powers beneath it. The goddess of the spring, who appears in various forms across the Celtic world, was understood as a manifestation of the sovereignty of the land itself, the power of the earth expressing itself through the upwelling of water. The Druids managed the sacred springs as they managed the sacred groves, as institutional authorities whose specialized knowledge enabled the community to interact with these places properly. Bath, the Roman spa town built around the hot spring of Sulis, preserves in its Roman name the dedication to the goddess Sul, later syncretized by the Romans with Minerva into Sulis Minerva. The bronze head of the goddess, found in the sacred spring, the extraordinary collection of curse tablets thrown into the water by worshippers, asking the goddess to pursue those who had wronged them, the quantities of coins and jewelry and votive objects that represent centuries of engagement with this sacred place, all speak to the intensity and continuity of devotion to this site. The Romans built a temple and a bath complex here, but they built it around a spring that was already sacred, that was already receiving offerings, that was already understood as a place where the boundary between the ordinary world and the divine world was thin. The Druids who managed this site before the Romans arrived did not leave texts. But the site itself is a text that can be read, and what it says is that the sacred spring tradition of Britain was ancient, organized, and maintained with institutional seriousness before Rome arrived to build its stone temple on top of it. The question of what became of the physical landscape of Druidic practice after the Roman period is one where the archaeology has been gradually revealing a more complex picture than the simple narrative of pagan destruction and Christian replacement suggests. Many of the sacred spring sites continued to be visited long after Christianity was established as the dominant framework for British religious life. The water was still sacred. The practice of throwing coins and objects into sacred waters persisted. The Church made repeated attempts to prohibit it and largely failed. The wells that had been sacred before Christianity became, in many cases, holy wells in the Christian tradition, associated with local saints who were frequently the Christianized forms of earlier divine figures. The water was still healing. The boundary was still thin. The pilgrimage was still made. The stone circles and standing stones presented a different problem. The Church was more successful in suppressing active ceremonial use of these sites, though the suppression was a long, slow process rather than a sudden break. The folk traditions associated with specific stone monuments, the beliefs about their powers, the stories that explained their presence, persisted in forms that the Church found difficult to eradicate, precisely because they were embedded in the landscape itself. You cannot remove the monument by forbidding people to visit it. And when people visit it, even with the intention of performing Christian devotion rather than pagan practice, the encounter with the stones themselves carries a weight that mere prohibition cannot always overcome. The place names of Britain are one of the most persistent carriers of the older landscape. Celtic names for rivers, hills, springs, and sacred places survive beneath and alongside the English and Latin names that were layered over them in the centuries following the Roman conquest. The Thames is a Celtic name, of disputed etymology, but clearly pre-Roman in origin. The rivers Avon, of which there are several, carry the Celtic word for river unchanged. The river Exe carries the Celtic word for water or fish. Hundreds of place names across Britain preserve the Celtic geography in phonetic form, often without the English speakers who use them today having any awareness of what the names mean. This is the landscape speaking, maintaining through the persistence of sound what the institutions that once organized the landscape's meaning could no longer maintain. The Christianization of Britain, which proceeded in different ways and at different speeds in different regions, produced a cultural synthesis that was neither fully Christian nor fully Celtic in its character, but something genuinely new that drew on both. The early Irish Church in particular, which was the most formative influence on British Christianity in the 5th and 6th centuries, was deeply shaped by the pre-Christian cultural environment. The monastic tradition that produced the great scriptoria, where the mythological texts were eventually written down, was itself partly shaped by the structures of the Druidic institution. The scholar monks, who maintained Latin learning and produced the books, were performing, in a different framework, some of the same functions that the Druids had performed. They were the specialists who maintained the tradition, who preserved the memory, who transmitted the accumulated knowledge of the civilization to the next generation. This is not to say that the monks were secret Druids, or that Christianity in Britain was a covert continuation of Druidic practice. It was not. The ideological differences between Christianity and Druidic belief were genuine and significant. But institutions shape the people who work within them, and the people who built and maintained the early Irish and British Church were people whose culture had been shaped by centuries of Druidic influence. Some of what they did, including the systematic collection and preservation of the older mythological material, was done in conscious engagement with that older tradition, sometimes critically, and sometimes, it seems, with genuine scholarly respect for what the tradition contained. Patrick himself, the missionary whose 5th century work is the foundation of Irish Christianity, was in dialogue with the Philid, the poet-scholars who maintained the pre-Christian tradition. The encounter is not simple. Patrick condemned Druidic practice and the authority of the Druids in the terms available to him in his theological framework. He did not pretend the Druids did not exist or that their authority was trivial. He had to argue against it, which means he recognized it as real enough to argue against. The hagiographical tradition that developed around Patrick in the centuries after his death elaborated this confrontation into formal dramatic encounters between the saint and the Druids, encounters in which the saint's miraculous power defeats the Druidic power and demonstrates the superiority of the new tradition. These stories are not historical, but they are cultural documents that record the lived experience of the Christianization process as a real confrontation with a real existing tradition that had genuine cultural authority. The surviving Irish mythological material contains Druids who are not the enemies of the heroes, but their advisors, their seers, their sources of knowledge about what is coming and how to face it. Cathbad, the Druid of the Ulster cycle, is one of the most important figures in that tradition. He is the advisor to the king Conchobar mac Nessa. He is the prophet who announces at Deirdre's birth that she will bring destruction on Ulster, setting in motion the tragedy that defines the cycle. He is the figure who knows what the signs mean, who can read the day and tell whether it is auspicious for battle or for the young warriors to take their arms. He has the knowledge that the king needs, but does not himself possess. He is not a peripheral figure. He is central to the operation of the court in a way that reflects the actual centrality of the Druidic institution to Celtic political life. The detail about the young warriors taking arms on a favourable day, which Cathbad manipulates to ensure that Cuchulainn receives his weapons on a day that will make him famous but short-lived, is a piece of Druidic practice embedded in the narrative. The selection of auspicious days for significant actions was a Druidic function. The interpretation of signs, the reading of the natural world for indications about the outcome of planned actions, was the specific domain of the Vates, the diviner class, but it was part of the broader Druidic institutional practice. The idea that there are better and worse days for different actions, encoded in the structure of time itself and accessible through trained interpretation, is one of the most persistent and widely distributed features of pre-modern human culture. The Druids' version of it was sophisticated enough to require specialized training to apply and to generate outcomes that the culture trusted enough to use as the basis for real decisions about real actions. The relationship between the Druids and the concept of truth is one of the most philosophically interesting dimensions of the tradition. In Celtic legal thought, the concept of the truth of a ruler was not simply a moral claim about honesty. It was a cosmological claim. A king who ruled in accordance with truth, who fulfilled his obligations, who maintained the proper relationships with the sacred powers, caused the land to be fertile, the rivers to run full, the cattle to be healthy, the harvests to be abundant. A king who violated truth brought disaster, failed harvests, cattle plague, military defeat, the withdrawal of the land's blessing. This concept, sometimes called the truth of a ruler, or in Irish fer flathamon, is found across the early Celtic material with a consistency that indicates it was a genuine element of the political philosophy, not a late literary invention. The Druids were the enforcers of this concept. They were the people who could determine whether the king was governing in truth or in violation of it, who could announce the consequences of violation, and who could perform the remedial rituals that might restore the proper relationship. This function connected the Druidic institution to the most fundamental concerns of the society: food, health, security, the conditions that made collective life possible. A society that understood agricultural success as dependent on the king's spiritual condition was a society in which the institution that monitored and maintained that spiritual condition had enormous practical importance. It was not simply ideology. It was, in the terms of the society's own understanding, practical governance. The practical dimension of this understanding is visible in the way the Druids appear in accounts of military campaigns. Before a battle, the Druids performed ritual acts and made pronouncements about the outcome. This is sometimes described in purely ceremonial terms as a kind of morale-boosting prophecy. But it was more than that. The Druidic pronouncements were based on the reading of signs, the assessment of the spiritual condition of the forces involved, the interpretation of the relationship between the parties, and the sacred powers that governed the outcome of conflict. In a society where military courage was understood to depend on the warriors' certainty that the justice of their cause and their proper relationship with the divine powers gave them the advantage, the Druidic assessment of the spiritual balance of forces was not separate from military reality. It was part of military reality. This is what Tacitus is describing when he says that the Druids on the Anglesey shore were a source of inspiration for resistance. They were not simply encouraging, they were performing the function that made the resistance meaningful in the terms the resisting population understood. They were confirming that the cause was right, that the powers were aligned with the defenders, that death, in the defense of the sacred landscape, was not death in the permanent sense, but transition in the context of cosmic justice. To destroy this institutional capacity was to destroy the framework within which the resistance made sense, which is why Paulinus destroyed the groves before he dealt with Boudica. The military threat from Boudica was real and urgent. The groves on Anglesey were more important. The relationship between the Druids and the concept of sacred geography connects to one of the most interesting questions in the whole tradition: the question of ley lines and the organization of the sacred landscape. This is a topic that has been thoroughly colonized by modern alternative spirituality and pseudo-archaeology, which makes it difficult to discuss in terms that are both accurate and accessible. The modern concept of ley lines, straight lines connecting ancient sacred sites across the landscape, was invented by Alfred Watkins in 1925 and has no ancient source. The idea that the ancient Britons intentionally constructed a network of straight alignments connecting sacred sites across hundreds of miles is not supported by the archaeological evidence in the form that the popular tradition maintains. But the question of whether the Druids organized the sacred landscape according to a systematic framework is not the same question, and the answer to it may be more interesting. The evidence that the prehistoric monument landscape of Britain is organized with attention to celestial alignments at individual sites is now well established. The evidence that there are meaningful relationships between groups of related sites in specific regions, that certain areas of the landscape were systematically developed as sacred territories with internal coherence, is increasingly supported by landscape archaeology. and the evidence that the Celtic peoples of the Iron Age understood their landscape as a sacred geography, organized around specific, powerful places, routes between them, and the accumulated cultural memory associated with both, is embedded in the mythological and place name record. The Druids, as the institution responsible for maintaining the cultural memory of the landscape, would have maintained knowledge of the relationship between significant places. The routes between sacred sites were not simply travel routes. They were ceremonial routes, traversed at specific times of year for specific purposes, connecting places that were understood to have specific complementary relationships in the sacred geography. The Irish Din Shenchas, the place name tradition that explains the sacred history of every significant place in Ireland, is the written descendant of exactly this kind of organized landscape knowledge. It tells you not just where a place is, but what happened there, what powers are associated with it, what obligations bind the community to it, how it fits into the larger sacred map of the island. This knowledge was Druidic knowledge in origin. The Philid who maintained and transmitted it in the medieval period were the literary heirs of the Druidic tradition. The burning question, for anyone who studies the Druids seriously, is the one that cannot be fully answered. What were they actually doing in the sacred groves? The ancient sources give us fragments: sacrifice, assembly, legal judgment, ceremony, the initiation of the young into the tradition, philosophy. These are institutional activities of enormous significance, but the specific character of the ritual life, the actual content of the ceremonies, the precise nature of the cosmological knowledge being transmitted, the detailed practice of the tradition, this is what the oral commitment and the Roman destruction together conspired to prevent us from knowing. What we can say is that the grove itself was a particular kind of space. The Nemeton was not simply a clearing in the forest. It was a made place, a space prepared and maintained for specific purposes. The natural world was not distinguished from the sacred world in Celtic thought in the way that later philosophical traditions drew that boundary. Nature was already sacred. The grove was a place where the sacred dimension of the natural world was especially concentrated, especially accessible. To be in the grove was to be in a more direct relationship with the powers that the Druidic tradition identified as the organizing principles of reality. The trees themselves were not just trees. The oak, the ash, the yew, each carried specific associations, specific kinds of power, specific relationships to the cosmological structure that the Druids maintained. The spring at the center of the grove was not just water. It was the point where the powers beneath the earth expressed themselves in the ordinary world. The combination of the tree-based sacred space and the spring within it appears at multiple Druidic sites in the archaeological record and in the literary tradition. The concept of the world tree, the great axis around which the cosmos is organized, appears in Celtic tradition in forms that parallel the Norse Yggdrasil and the various world tree traditions of other Indo-European cultures. The sacred oak may have functioned as a local manifestation of this cosmological principle, a grounded version of the great axis, a place where the ordinary world touched the structure of the cosmos itself. To perform ceremony under the oak, to make judgment in its shade, to initiate the young into the tradition in its presence, was to perform these acts in a space that was already understood to be connected to the largest possible framework. The yew tree deserves particular attention in this context. The yew appears in the Celtic sacred tradition with a frequency and intensity that rivals the oak. The oldest yew trees in Britain, some of which may be 3,000 to 5,000 years old, are located predominantly in churchyards, a fact that is not accidental. The church was built on the sacred site. The sacred site was marked by the yew. The yew, because of its extraordinary longevity, its evergreen character through even the darkest winters, its capacity for self-regeneration through the layering of its branches to the ground, and its production of a substance, taxine, that is powerfully toxic, carried associations that made it a natural symbol for the Druidic themes of death, continuity, and the knowledge that penetrates beyond death. The poisonous quality of the yew, its ability to kill, connected it to the knowledge of the boundary between life and death that was central to Druidic philosophical practice. The regenerative quality, the tree's capacity to live for thousands of years and to renew itself repeatedly, connected it to the doctrine of the soul's continuity through successive existences. The oldest yew in Britain is almost certainly more than 2,000 years old. it may be substantially older. There are individual yew trees in Welsh and English churchyards that, according to careful analysis of their growth patterns and girth measurements, may have been saplings in the Bronze Age. These trees were alive when the Druids performed their ceremonies under the oaks and the yews of the British Nemeton. They are still alive today. They are the most direct biological connection to the Druidic period that the landscape of Britain contains. And they are, appropriately, still surrounded by the dead, still marking the boundary between the living world and what lies beyond it, still doing in the Christian context something not entirely unlike what they were doing in the older context whose name we have lost. The tradition of wisdom associated with specific old trees in the Celtic world is not simply literary. It reflects a genuine understanding of the tree as the oldest form of life in the landscape, the entity that has persisted through more cycles of change than any human community could maintain in its living memory. The Druidic consultation of specific trees, the practice of listening to the sound of the wind in the leaves as a form of divination, the identification of specific trees as oracles, all of these reflect the understanding that long duration is a form of knowledge, that what has persisted longest has the most to teach about what persistence requires. This is not simply poetic, it is a philosophical position about the nature of knowledge and its relationship to time. The Druids, as the institution dedicated to the longest duration knowledge, the 20-year training in the accumulated tradition, would naturally have a particular relationship with the entities that embodied long duration in the natural world. The astronomical alignments built into the stone monuments of the landscape were, in this framework, another expression of the same principle. The stones had been placed by the ancestors to encode knowledge of celestial patterns that unfold across timescales longer than any human lifetime. To maintain the knowledge of what the stones were saying was to maintain a connection to a form of wisdom that stretched further back than any living memory could reach, to the accumulated observation of generations of predecessors who had watched the sky and encoded what they saw in the landscape. The Druidic institution was the living bridge between that deep-time wisdom and the present generation. While it existed, the connection between the present and the deep past was maintained. When it was destroyed, the connection was severed. The stones are still there. The alignment of the midwinter sunrise at Stonehenge still happens every year. But the framework within which it was understood, and the institutional knowledge of what that understanding required and enabled, is gone. The disappearance of the Druids is not simply the disappearance of a religious institution. It is the disappearance of a particular relationship to knowledge, a particular understanding of how knowledge is accumulated, transmitted, and applied, a particular framework for understanding the relationship between the human world and the world that lies beyond and beneath it. The Roman victory was not simply a military victory, it was an epistemological victory. The Roman framework for understanding reality, which was based on writing, on formal logic, on the separation of philosophy from practical governance, on the identification of legitimate religious practice with state-sanctioned cult, displaced a framework built on memory, on the oral transmission of accumulated wisdom, on the integration of philosophy and governance and ritual into a single institutional practice, on the understanding that legitimate authority derives from the land and the cosmic powers associated with it, rather than from the imperial center. Neither framework is simply right or simply wrong. Each enables certain kinds of understanding and forecloses others. The Roman framework that prevailed enabled the development of literacy-based knowledge systems, written law, urban civilization, and eventually the accumulated scientific tradition that has produced the world we live in. The Druidic framework that was destroyed enabled something different. It enabled the maintenance of a relationship to the natural world that treated it as a source of knowledge rather than a resource to be exploited. It enabled the integration of philosophical sophistication with practical governance in a way that did not require the bureaucratic apparatus of a state to sustain. It enabled the transmission of knowledge across deep time through the cultivation of memory in ways that may have preserved genuine empirical observation across thousands of years in forms we are only beginning to recognize. The loss is real. The fact that the Druids are gone means that we cannot know what they knew. We can recover fragments through the archaeology, through the comparative mythology, through the scattered references in the ancient sources, through the careful analysis of the later Celtic material for traces of the older framework. But the tradition itself is gone. and there is no institution today that can recover it in its original form, no matter how sincerely some practitioners of modern Druidry might wish it otherwise. Modern Druidry is a genuine spiritual tradition, but it is a modern invention drawing on partial and filtered information about an ancient tradition that is not recoverable in the form it once took. This is not a criticism of modern Druidry. It is simply a statement of historical fact that must be made clearly in order to have an honest conversation about what the ancient Druids actually were. What the ancient Druids actually were is still being worked out. The archaeology is not finished. The analysis of the late Celtic material has not been exhausted. The place name research is ongoing. New techniques for analyzing ancient sites are producing new information. The satellite archaeology that has revealed the extent of the monument landscape in its full complexity, the geophysical survey methods that can detect buried features without excavation, the genetic analysis of ancient skeletal material that is beginning to shed light on the population history of the British Isles in ways that illuminate the cultural history. All of these tools are adding information to a picture that is still developing. What we know with confidence is this: the Druids were a real institution, not a Roman invention, not a later mythological construction. They operated for several centuries at least, probably longer, in Britain, Ireland, and Gaul. They held judicial, philosophical, ceremonial, educational, and political functions that together made them the most important institution in Celtic society. They were systematically targeted for destruction by Rome in ways that make clear the Romans understood exactly how important they were. They were destroyed so thoroughly that they left no written texts, no physical monuments attributable specifically to their practice, and no directly transmitted tradition. What survived is fragments, preserved in the oral traditions that eventually became the written mythological and legal texts of medieval Ireland and Wales, in the place names and the folk practices that persisted through Christianization, and in the stones of the monument landscape that they maintained but did not build. The fact that they terrified every civilization that encountered them and vanished without a trace is not simply a mystery in the dramatic sense. It is an observation about what it means when an institution dedicated to memory is destroyed. The institution is gone. The memory it carried is gone. The tradition that it organized is gone. What remains is the evidence that something was there, and the persistent, uncomfortable sense that what was there was real, was important, and was lost before we could understand it properly. The Calendni calendar, which we can study in its reconstructed form, tells us that the Druids understood time as something organized and cyclical and manageable through specialized knowledge. The bog bodies tell us that the Druidic tradition engaged with the deepest questions of sacrifice and the relationship between the individual and the community and the divine powers in ways that we find unsettling because we do not have the framework within which those practices made sense. The sacred springs and the holy wells that persist across Britain and Ireland tell us that the understanding of certain places as specially connected to the powers beneath the ordinary world was real and persistent, and impossible to simply erase through institutional destruction. The astronomical alignments of the monument landscape tell us that the accumulated knowledge of the sky across generations was organized and maintained with institutional seriousness before it was eventually lost. The 20 years. The 20 years of training that Caesar describes is the figure that stays with you most persistently when you think about the Druids. 20 years. A complete generation of education before you were considered prepared to take on the functions of the institution. A period so long that many students, Caesar says, committed only part of the curriculum to memory and emerged as specialists rather than as fully trained Druids in the complete sense. What kind of institution invests 20 years in the training of a single practitioner? What kind of knowledge requires 20 years to transmit? The answer has to be knowledge of extraordinary depth and complexity accumulated over an extraordinarily long period, organized with institutional seriousness, and understood to be important enough that the investment of 20 years of a person's life was worth making. We do not know what all of it contained. We know some of what it contained because the fragments that survived are extraordinary enough in their own right to give us a sense of the scale of what was lost. The astronomical knowledge, the philosophy of the soul, the legal tradition, the botanical and medical knowledge, the mythological and cosmological narratives, the ceremonial practice, the management of the sacred landscape, the maintenance of the political framework through the concept of the sacred king and the truth of sovereignty. All of this, and more, that we cannot even identify because the traces are too few, was contained in the tradition that 20 years of training transmitted, and it is gone. The disappearance without a trace is not quite accurate as a description, because traces are what we have. They are simply traces that require the right kind of attention to read. The stones read correctly, the place names read correctly, the folk practices that survived because they were too embedded in daily life to be fully eradicated read correctly. The late Celtic literary tradition reads correctly, with attention to what the Christian literary framework was preserving despite itself. These traces together form a picture of something that was much larger than what we can recover, but the picture is real, and the tradition it represents was real, and the loss of it is a loss that cannot be recovered, but can at least be understood in its dimensions. The Anglesey Grove burning in 60 CE is the moment we always come back to, because it is the most documented moment of deliberate institutional destruction in the record. Paulinus crossed to the island, the Druids made their stand, the legions advanced, the groves burned, and the institution that had organized British Celtic culture for centuries, that had maintained the memory of the landscape across deep time, that had transmitted a philosophy of the soul and of cosmic justice, and of the continuity of knowledge through oral transmission, was broken. Some of it went to Ireland. Some of it dispersed into the landscape in forms that were no longer institutional but purely cultural. Some of it was lost. The tradition that had terrified the Roman legions, not through military capability, but through the sheer weight of an alternative understanding of what the world was and what it required, that tradition was dismantled, piece by piece, through the burning of groves and the killing of practitioners and the prohibition of the practice. And in the generations that followed, it became memory, then legend, then archaeology, then a question we are still asking because the answer matters, and because the stones are still here and still saying something that we have not yet fully learned to hear. The question of what the Romans were actually afraid of is the one that shapes everything else in this story. Fear is a specific thing. It has an object, a reason, a structure. When Rome expressed fear of the Druids, or when Rome acted in the ways that fear tends to produce, with disproportionate and specifically targeted responses, with legislative prohibitions before military campaigns, with the burning of groves rather than the simple garrisoning of territory, it was responding to something identifiable. Understanding what that something was requires stepping back from the Roman narrative frame, which always presents the Druids as superstition to be overcome by reason, and asking the question that the Roman frame was designed to prevent: what would it have looked like from inside? From inside the Celtic world, the Druids were not the promoters of irrational fear. They were the people who most accurately understood the structure of reality and how to navigate it. The knowledge they maintained was not superstition. It was a different epistemological tradition, organized around different assumptions about what kinds of knowledge matter and how they should be accumulated and transmitted. The Romans understood knowledge as something that was most reliably preserved in written form, that was most legitimately produced through formal philosophical reasoning, and that was most usefully applied through bureaucratic and administrative structures. The Druids understood knowledge as something that was most reliably preserved in trained living memory, that was most legitimately produced through accumulated observation across generations, and that was most usefully applied through the direct engagement of trained specialists with the specific situations they encountered. These are not simply different methods, they are different ontologies. The Roman epistemological framework assumes that the world is primarily a physical system that behaves according to regular laws that can be discovered through reason and applied through technology. The Druidic epistemological framework assumes that the world is primarily a relational system in which the relationships between human communities and the natural and divine powers that co-inhabit the landscape are as real and as practically important as the physical facts of the landscape itself. Managing those relationships well is not superstition, it is governance. It requires specialized knowledge. It requires institutional authority. It requires the kind of long-duration transmission that 20 years of training provides. Rome was afraid of the Druids, not because the Druids were irrational, but because the Druids represented a competing framework for understanding and organizing reality that was coherent, sophisticated, and deeply embedded in the culture of the population Rome was trying to govern. As long as that framework was maintained by a living institution with genuine cultural authority, the Roman administrative project in Britain could never be fully completed. The population would always have a competing source of legitimate authority, a competing framework for understanding what their obligations were and what the world required of them. The Druids were the obstacle, not despite their intellectual sophistication, but because of it. A primitive superstition can be dismissed and forgotten. A sophisticated philosophical and institutional tradition with 2,000 years of development behind it cannot be simply dismissed. It has to be destroyed. The specific timing of the Claudian edict against Druidic practice, which preceded the military conquest of Britain, is instructive. The edict was issued in 43 CE, the same year as the Claudian invasion. This is not coincidence. It represents a strategic understanding that the military conquest and the destruction of the institutional framework were two aspects of the same project, to be pursued simultaneously. The military campaign would take control of the physical territory. The edict would begin the process of delegitimizing the institution that organized cultural resistance. The eventual burning of the Anglesey groves in 60 CE completed a project that had been conceived as a single operation nearly 2 decades earlier. The care with which Rome targeted the Druids, the specificity of the legislative prohibition, the deliberate military campaign against the Anglesey sanctuary rather than any strategically important military objective, and the systematic suppression that continued until the institution ceased to exist, all speak to a level of institutional analysis on Rome's part that suggests genuine respect for the opponent. You do not need to pass a specific law against an institution that poses no real threat. You do not need to burn specific sacred sites when a general military consolidation would suffice. The precision of Rome's targeting of the Druids is itself evidence that Rome understood exactly what the Druids were and why they mattered. The Irish preservation of the tradition, partial and transformed as it is, raises an interesting counterfactual. What would Britain look like if Ireland's situation had been Britain's situation? If the tradition had maintained institutional continuity through the Christian period? If the Fillid and the Brehon lawyers had continued their work in Britain, as they did in Ireland, until the English conquest of the 12th century and beyond, the question is unanswerable but illuminating. Ireland maintained a sophisticated literary and legal tradition rooted in the pre-Christian Celtic framework that produced in the early medieval period a body of literature, mythology, philosophy, and legal thought that has no equivalent in the same period in most of Western Europe. The monks of Iona and Lindisfarne, many of them trained in the Irish monastic tradition, reintroduced sophisticated learning to Britain after the disruptions of the post-Roman period. The learning they brought was Christian in its framework, but Celtic in its texture. What this suggests is that the Druidic tradition, where it survived in the attenuated institutional form of the Irish Fillid and the Brehon lawyers, was capable of producing extraordinary intellectual work in the period when it still had institutional continuity. The loss in Britain, where the institutional continuity was broken by Roman conquest 5 centuries before it was broken in Ireland, represents a different trajectory, one in which the tradition dispersed into the landscape and the folk practice without the institutional structure that would have allowed it to develop in the way the Irish tradition developed. The difference between Ireland and Britain in the early medieval period is partly the difference between a tradition that maintained institutional continuity and a tradition that lost it. The specific question of the Brehon law and what it reveals about the Druidic intellectual tradition is worth spending some time on. The surviving Brehon law texts, written in archaic Irish that was already difficult for medieval readers, preserve a legal philosophy that is recognizably Celtic in its principles and recognizably sophisticated in its elaboration. The law of distress, the formal procedure for enforcing obligations by the seizure of the debtor's cattle with precisely specified timing and witness requirements, is a legal mechanism of considerable elegance that reflects a deep understanding of the social dynamics of a cattle-based pastoral economy. The law of honor price, the principle that every person in the society has a specific honor value that determines both the compensation owed for harm done to them and their capacity to serve as a witness or guarantor in legal proceedings, is a social philosophy that has been compared favorably to modern theories of social capital. The law of the three kingdoms, the formal framework for the management of relationships between neighboring political entities, is a theory of international relations that recognized the need for formal mechanisms to manage disputes peacefully in a world without a superior authority capable of imposing order. The procedures for hosting and hospitality, the formal obligations of provision and welcome that governed the relationship between ruler and subject and between neighboring communities, are social mechanisms for the redistribution of resources and the maintenance of relationships across political boundaries that reflect sophisticated economic thinking. All of this was maintained orally in the Druidic tradition, transmitted through the training system, applied by practitioners who had internalized both the rules and the principles underlying them. This is the tradition that Britain lost when the Druids were destroyed. Not simply the ritual and the ceremony, not simply the philosophy of the soul, but a working legal and social philosophy that had organized a complex society for centuries. The Romans replaced it with Roman law, which was in many ways more technically sophisticated. But Roman law was not designed for the kind of society the Celts had built, and the application of Roman administrative frameworks to Celtic social structures produced disruptions that the historical record shows clearly in the archaeology of the provincial period. The hill forts were abandoned, but not because they were conquered. Many were abandoned voluntarily as the population moved into the new Roman-style towns. The social structures that had organized life within the hill fort economy dissolved, and what replaced them was a provincial Roman economy that, for the lower strata of the population, may not have been an improvement. The question of whether ordinary Celtic Britons benefited from the Roman conquest is one of the most contested in British historical scholarship, and it is not one that can be answered simply. The elite benefited, at least in the short term, through access to Roman goods, Roman administrative roles, and Roman military service. The urban population that developed around the new towns benefited from the amenities of urban life. But the rural population, which was the overwhelming majority, experienced the Roman period primarily as taxation, labor obligation, and the disruption of the social and cultural frameworks within which their lives had previously made sense. The Druidic institution had been part of what made those frameworks function. Its destruction did not benefit the rural population. It simply removed the institutional infrastructure that had organized their collective life. The pattern of resistance that continued throughout the Romano-British period, most dramatically in the Boudiccan Revolt but in smaller forms throughout the occupation, reflects the persistence of cultural identity and political grievance in a population that had been militarily conquered but not culturally absorbed. The persistence of Celtic religion in syncretic forms, the maintenance of the sacred spring traditions, the continued attachment to the landscape in terms that were not fully Roman, all of these are evidence that the destruction of the Druidic institution did not destroy the cultural framework that the institution had maintained. It simply left that framework without its organizing intelligence, without the trained practitioners who could maintain it with full sophistication and apply it with the authority that 20 years of training provided. What you get when you destroy the institution that organizes a culture is not simply an absence. You get a culture that continues to operate according to its inherited patterns, but without the capacity to develop those patterns, to apply them with full sophistication, to adapt them intelligently to new situations. The folk magic of rural Britain in the Romano-British and post-Roman period is not Druidic practice, but it preserves elements of the Druidic framework in degraded and partially understood forms, the way a folk song preserves the melody of a formal composition long after the formal composition itself has been lost. The people practicing the folk magic did not know where their practices came from. They had lost access to the institutional knowledge that would have allowed them to understand what they were doing and why. They had the residue of the tradition without the tradition itself. This is the specific tragedy of the Druidic destruction. Not simply that sophisticated people were killed and their institution demolished, but that the transmission chain was broken. The oral tradition depends absolutely on the continuity of trained practitioners passing knowledge to trained practitioners. Break that chain, and the knowledge does not simply become less accessible, it begins to degrade immediately. Within a generation of the Anglesey burning, the Druids who had completed their training were dead or scattered. The students who had been partway through the 20 years were left with incomplete knowledge, unable to transmit the full tradition. Within 2 generations, the institutional structure that had maintained the tradition was gone, and what remained was fragments in the memories of people who had received incomplete transmission gradually dissolving into the broader cultural inheritance without the structure that had kept them coherent. The fragments that survived are extraordinary, precisely because they survived against the odds. The later Irish material represents a partial rescue, conducted by people who were not entirely sure what they were rescuing or why it mattered, who preserved it for reasons that mixed Christian literary interest with genuine respect for the older tradition and simple cultural continuity. The result is a tradition that preserved much of the mythological and legal framework while losing the specific philosophical and astronomical content, the parts that were most directly at odds with Christian cosmology and therefore most likely to be actively suppressed rather than simply preserved in archaic form. The astronomical content is the most completely lost. We have the Coligny calendar, which tells us the Druids were sophisticated in their management of the solar and lunar cycles. We have the monument landscape, which tells us the culture they inherited had sophisticated astronomical knowledge encoded in it. We have the references in the ancient sources to Druidic teaching about the stars and the structure of the universe. But we do not have the actual astronomical tradition. We do not know what system they used for predicting celestial events. We do not know what mythological narratives were attached to specific celestial configurations. We do not know what the Druids thought the stars were, or what their movements meant for human life. This is the deepest loss, and it is the most complete. The monument landscape gives us the alignments. It does not give us the interpretation, the understanding within which the alignments made sense. The megalithic yard, proposed by Alexander Thom as a standard unit of measurement used in the construction of the stone circles of Britain, is an example of the kind of question that the loss of the tradition leaves unresolvable. Thom spent decades analyzing the geometry of hundreds of stone circles and argued, on statistical grounds, that the constructors were using a consistent unit of length approximately equal to 83 centimeters. The argument has been contested. Some archaeologists accept the evidence for a standard unit. Others argue that the statistical analysis does not support the conclusion. The truth of the matter cannot be established definitively because the tradition within which the measurements were made and the purposes they served is gone. If the Druids had maintained the constructors' tradition, they would have been able to tell us. Without them, we are left with the stones and the statistical arguments and the unresolvable uncertainty. This kind of unresolvable uncertainty is the condition we are in for most of the most important questions about the Druids and the tradition they maintained. We know enough to know what we have lost. We do not know enough to recover it. This is a specifically painful epistemic position, different from simply not knowing, because the fragments we have are sufficient to reveal the outline of what was there without being sufficient to reconstruct its content. You can see that there was something. You cannot see what it was. You can tell that it mattered enormously. You cannot tell exactly what it meant or why it mattered in the precise terms it would have been understood in by the people for whom it was the organizing framework of their lives. The later history of Druidic memory in Britain follows a trajectory that is worth understanding because the modern encounter with the Druids is shaped by that trajectory in ways that are not always acknowledged. The Druids essentially disappeared from the British consciousness during the Roman and early Christian periods. They were not maintained as a memory in the way that the Irish maintained their tradition, because the institutional continuity was gone, and with it the cultural investment in the memory. The Druids were a Roman problem, then a solved Roman problem, then a historical footnote. They returned to visibility in the 17th century, when antiquarians like John Aubrey began studying the ancient monuments of Britain and asking questions about who had built them and what they had been for. The association of the Druids with Stonehenge that Aubrey proposed was historically wrong, as we have established, but it was a culturally powerful wrong association that filled a genuine need. Britain was, in the 17th and 18th centuries, engaged in the construction of a national historical narrative, a story about who the British were and where they had come from. The Druids offered a distinguished prehistoric pedigree, an ancient intellectual and spiritual tradition that predated both Rome and the Church and could be claimed as distinctively British. William Stukeley, who followed Aubrey and developed the Druidic association with the stone monuments most elaborately in the 18th century, was himself an ordained clergyman who attempted to construct a synthesis between Druidic practice and early Christianity that would allow him to embrace both. His Druidism was a romantic construction, drawing on fragments of the ancient sources and on his own philosophical and spiritual inclinations, organized by the intellectual fashions of his time rather than by careful historical analysis. But it was enormously influential, and it established the popular image of the Druids as white-robed nature mystics gathered at Stonehenge that persists to this day in the popular imagination. The 19th century Romantic movement reinforced this image and added to it. The Celtic Revival, which produced the Ossian poems, the recovery and publication of medieval Irish and Welsh texts, the paintings of the pre-Raphaelite movement, the music of composers fascinated by Celtic themes, all contributed to a picture of the Druids as romantic figures from a golden age of spiritual purity that contrasted favorably with industrial modernity. This was not history. It was the use of historical material for contemporary cultural purposes. But it kept the Druids in the public consciousness and eventually fed into the development of modern Druidry as a spiritual movement in the 20th century. The relationship between modern Druidry and ancient Druidic practice is one that requires honest acknowledgement of the gap between them. Modern Druidry is a genuine spiritual tradition that draws on fragments of the ancient record, on the later Celtic literary tradition, on 19th and 20th century Romantic interpretation, and on the lived spiritual experience of its practitioners. It is not a continuation of the ancient tradition because the ancient tradition was not transmitted continuously. It is a modern reconstruction, and like all modern reconstructions, it reflects the concerns and values of the modern world as much as it reflects what the ancient sources contain. This is not a criticism. Modern Druidry has produced communities of practice, relationships with the natural world, and forms of spiritual engagement that are valuable in their own terms. But the ancient Druids and the modern Druids are not the same thing, and conflating them does a disservice to both. The annual ceremonies at Stonehenge, which modern Druids conduct at the solstices and equinoxes, are evocative and beautiful. They are not ancient Druidic ceremonies. The stones were not built by Druids. The specific rituals performed there have no ancient source. But they express something genuine about the human need to mark the turning points of the year, to gather at significant places, to maintain some form of relationship with the landscape and the forces that shape it. If the ancient Druids were doing something that addressed those same needs, then there is a functional continuity even in the absence of institutional continuity. The form is different, the impulse is recognizable. The academic study of the Druids has made enormous progress in the past several decades, moving away from the romantic images of the 19th century and the credulous alternative history of the 20th century toward a more careful engagement with the actual evidence. The work of scholars like Miranda Green, Barry Cunliffe, Peter Beresford Ellis, and many others has produced a picture of the ancient Druids that is both more complex and more interesting than either the romantic image or the simple dismissal allows. The Druids were real, they were important, they were sophisticated, and the evidence for all of these claims is genuine, even if it is fragmentary and requires careful handling. The archaeological work at sites like the Snettisham Treasure in Norfolk, where one of the most spectacular collections of Celtic metalwork ever found was deliberately buried in the late Iron Age in a way that looks ceremonial rather than simply precautionary, continues to add texture to our understanding of the Celtic world in the Druidic period. The Snettisham Talks, golden neck rings of extraordinary craftsmanship, were buried in multiple hoards at a single site, with a deliberateness that suggests offering rather than concealment. The metalwork they represent is itself evidence of a sophisticated culture with access to significant resources and the organizational capacity to direct those resources toward the production of elaborate ceremonial objects. The Druids who managed the ceremonies for which those objects were made are gone. The objects that speak to the scale and seriousness of those ceremonies remain. The question of the talks themselves, which are one of the most characteristic objects of the Celtic archaeological record, is connected to the Druidic tradition in ways that are suggestive. The talk, a twisted metal collar worn around the neck, is associated in the ancient sources with the warrior class, but also with deities. Many of the divine images from the Celtic world, including the famous Gundestrup cauldron with its intricate narrative images, show divine figures wearing or holding torques. The material value of the torques, combined with their positioning on the body at the neck, the point where the head meets the body, the most vulnerable point of the warrior, connects them to the ideas about the relationship between physical and divine identity that the Druidic philosophical tradition maintained. The head cult of the Celtic world, the specific emphasis on the head as the seat of personal identity and divine connection, is one of the most consistently documented features of Celtic religious practice across a wide geographic range. The human head appears as a decorative motif in Celtic art. Human heads were collected as trophies after battle, not simply as proof of military success but as ceremonial objects in their own right. The stone-carved heads that appear in various forms across the Celtic world, some of them clearly votive, placed in sacred springs or buried at sacred sites, are evidence of a consistent understanding of the head as a locus of power that could be accessed and employed through proper ceremonial treatment. The Druids, as the specialists in the management of the relationship between the human world and the divine world, would have been the people who understood the specific protocols for the proper treatment of sacred heads and the purposes to which their power could be applied. The famous account of the Celts eating the brains of enemies mixed with lime as a kind of ceremonial food or trophy preparation is one of the most extreme examples in the Roman sources of practices designed to horrify a Roman audience. Whether it was accurate as a widespread practice, or extreme as an occasional ritual act misrepresented as the norm, or simply invented for rhetorical effect, is not entirely clear. But the emphasis on the head in the material record is real and consistent enough to indicate that the Roman sources were picking up on something genuinely distinctive in Celtic ceremonial culture, even if their specific descriptions were shaped by rhetorical purpose. The head cult connects to the Druidic doctrine of the soul's location and transmission. In Celtic mythology, the soul is often associated with the head or with the breath, the visible manifestation of the interior life. The idea that the power of a particularly significant person could be accessed through their head, that the skull could serve as an oracle or a vessel of divine wisdom, appears in the mythological tradition, in forms that suggest genuine belief rather than literary invention. The Bran tradition in Welsh mythology, in which the severed head of the giant King Bran continues to speak and provide wisdom for years after his death, is one of the most extended explorations of this concept. The head of Bran feeds a company of survivors through supernatural provision, protects them from grief, and eventually is buried to protect Britain from invasion. This is a mythological elaboration of a specific philosophical understanding of what the head contains and what it can provide even after the body it belonged to has ceased to function. The Druids who managed the ceremonies surrounding the dead and the transition of the soul from one existence to another would have been the people who understood the specific protocols for engaging with what the head contained. Their 20 years of training would have included the philosophy of the soul's location, transmission, and continued existence, and the practical procedures for managing the boundaries between the living and the dead in ways that served the community. This is not simply morbid fascination with death. It is the sophisticated management of one of the most practically important transitions in communal life. Every community loses its members. The question of how to manage those losses, what the dead owe the living, what the living owe the dead, and how to maintain the relationship between them in ways that support rather than destabilize communal life, is a practical question of governance, and the Druids answered it. The specific ritual at the termination of the year, the Samhain festival, is the most detailed example we have of the Druidic management of the boundary between the living and the dead. In the Irish material, Samhain is the time when the Sid mounds, the entrances to the otherworld, are open, when the dead can communicate with the living, and the living can venture into the otherworld. It is also the time when the forces that threaten the order of the world are most active and most dangerous, the time when the boundaries that normally keep chaos at bay are at their thinnest. The ceremonies of Samhain were not simply commemorative, they were protective. They managed the opening of the boundary in ways that allowed beneficial contact with the ancestors while protecting against the malevolent forces that could also enter through the same opening. The management of this festival required exactly the kind of specialized knowledge that the Druidic training system provided. You needed to know the signs that indicated when the boundary was opening. You needed to know the specific protocols for establishing communication with the ancestors in ways that were safe and productive. You needed to know the protective measures that kept the dangerous forces at bay. You needed to know when the festival was coming, which required the astronomical knowledge of the calendar. You needed to have the authority that the community trusted to perform the ceremonies properly and effectively. All of this was Druidic knowledge. All of it was lost when the institution was destroyed. What survived in the folk tradition of Halloween is the echo of the framework, without the framework itself, the shape of the ceremony without the understanding of what the ceremony was doing and why it needed to be done correctly. The persistence of Halloween across the centuries of Christian suppression, its survival as a folk practice that the Church repeatedly tried to eliminate or absorb, is itself evidence of how deeply embedded the Samhain framework was in the cultural life of the British Isles. The Church replaced it with All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, which perform some of the same functions in the Christian framework, commemorating the dead and maintaining the community's relationship with those who have passed. But the folk practice kept the older form alive alongside and eventually beneath the Christian observances, and it is the folk form, not the Christian one, that has proven most durable in the long run. Halloween is now a global phenomenon. All Saints' Day is not. The persistence of the old framework, even in the decontextualized commercial form that Halloween has become, is a measure of how deeply rooted the original concept was, in the human need to mark the boundary between the living and the dead. The Druidic understanding of the natural world was not simply the observation of nature, it was a philosophy of relationship. The natural world, in the Druidic framework, was not a backdrop against which human activity occurred. It was an active participant in the larger system of relationships that constituted reality. The oak and the spring and the standing stone and the bog were not neutral features of the landscape. They were entities with their own natures, their own powers, their own relationships to the divine forces that animated reality. To live in this landscape properly required understanding those natures, those powers, and those relationships. The Druids were the people who understood them most thoroughly and who maintained the institutional knowledge of how to engage with them correctly. The word nature does not capture what the Druids were engaged with, because nature implies a category separate from the human and divine worlds. The Celtic framework did not make that separation. The human world, the natural world, and the divine world were all aspects of the same reality, interpenetrating and mutually constitutive. Managing the relationships between human activity and the powers that co-inhabited the landscape was not a spiritual luxury. It was a practical necessity, as real and as demanding as the management of the agricultural economy or the resolution of political disputes. The Druids managed all three of these dimensions simultaneously, because in the Celtic framework they were not three separate domains. They were three aspects of a single domain that required integrated management. The loss of this integrated framework, the replacement of it with the Roman system that separated law from religion, from philosophy, from the management of the natural world, into distinct institutional domains with distinct specialists, is not simply the replacement of one system by another. It is the replacement of an integrated understanding with a fragmented one. The Roman system could develop each of its fragments more intensively than the integrated Celtic system could develop any single aspect. This is why Roman law is more technically sophisticated than Brehon law in certain respects, why Roman philosophy is more systematically elaborated than anything we can reconstruct of Druidic philosophy, why Roman engineering is more technically impressive than anything the Celtic world produced. But the gain in each fragment came with a loss in the integration, and the loss of integration meant the loss of the capacity to understand and manage the relationships between the fragments. The ecological crisis of the modern world is, among other things, a consequence of the fragmentation of human knowledge about the natural world from human knowledge about how to live in it. Modern science can tell us with extraordinary precision what climate change is doing to the natural systems that support human life. Modern political science, economics, are much less clear about how to manage the relationship between human activity and those natural systems in ways that maintain their functionality. The two kinds of knowledge have been developed in separate institutional frameworks, with separate epistemological traditions, and integrating them is proving very difficult. The Druidic tradition, whatever its limitations, was built on the premise that these two kinds of knowledge could not be separated, that understanding the natural world and understanding how to live in relationship with it were two aspects of the same inquiry. The loss of that premise has consequences that we are still working out. This is not an argument for romanticizing the Druidic tradition or pretending that it offered solutions to problems it could not have anticipated. The Druids were not ecologists in the modern sense, and their framework, which included human sacrifice and which maintained systems of social inequality that were severe by any standard, was not a utopian alternative to modernity. But the specific insight that the relationships between human activity and the natural world require specialized, institutionally maintained knowledge to manage properly is an insight that has relevance beyond the specific cultural context in which it was developed. It is an insight that the Druidic tradition developed to a high degree of sophistication and then lost when the institution that maintained it was destroyed. The physical landscape of Britain still carries the traces of the world the Druids managed. The sacred springs, many of them still active, still visited by people seeking healing or making wishes, still associated in folk memory with powers that exist on a different register from ordinary experience. The ancient trees, the yews particularly, still marking the boundaries between the ordinary world and what lies beyond it in the churchyards that were built around them. The place names, still encoding in their phonology the meanings that the Druids attached to the landscape, available to anyone who knows how to read them. The monument landscape, still oriented toward the celestial patterns that the Druids maintained knowledge of, still performing its astronomical function whether anyone is watching or not. The winter solstice still comes. The sun still rises at the southeastern horizon, its lowest point of the year, and touches the back stone of the Newgrange Passage tomb in Ireland in the way it has touched it for 5,000 years. The people who built Newgrange are not the Druids. They predate the Druids by more than 2,000 years, but the tradition that the Druids maintained and the tradition that built Newgrange are connected through the continuity of the culture that inhabited the British Isles across those millennia, a continuity that we can trace in the genetics of the population, in the persistence of certain symbolic forms, in the landscape itself, which carries the accumulated inscriptions of all the cultures that have inhabited it. The Druids are the missing link in that chain of continuity. They are the institution that connected the monument-building culture of the Neolithic and Bronze Age to the literary culture that eventually produced the mythological texts of medieval Ireland and Wales. They maintained across several centuries the knowledge of what the monuments meant, the philosophical framework within which the ancient astronomical knowledge was interpreted, the legal and social traditions that organized collective life. They were the living memory between the past and what came after, and when they were destroyed, the chain was broken, and what came after had to reconstruct its connection to the past through fragments. The midsummer sunrise at Stonehenge still happens. It still illuminates the heel stone and casts its shadow toward the altar stone at the center of the monument. The geometry is still there, still doing what it was designed to do, but the people who understood what it meant, who maintained the philosophical and ceremonial framework within which the alignment was significant, who performed the rituals that connected the astronomical event to the larger understanding of the world's structure and human life within it. Those people are gone. The stones remember. The framework for understanding what the stones remember is the thing that was destroyed on Anglesey in 60 CE and that has not been fully recovered in the 19.5 centuries since. This is what it means to say the Druids vanished without a trace. They did not literally leave no traces. They left traces everywhere. In the landscape, in the place names, in the folk practices, in the later literary tradition, but the trace of the institution itself, the trace of the specific knowledge that 20 years of training transmitted, the trace of the philosophical and astronomical and legal and ceremonial framework in its full sophistication, that trace is not there. It was erased not by time but by deliberate institutional destruction, and what survived is the shadow of the institution, not the institution itself. The decision to destroy the Druids, rather than absorb them, was one of the most consequential cultural decisions in the history of the British Isles. It determined the shape of British cultural development for the next 2,000 years and beyond. It severed the connection between the modern world and the specific form of deep knowledge that the Druidic tradition had developed. It left the landscape full of signs that could no longer be fully read. It left the later literary tradition full of fragments that could no longer be fully understood because the institutional context that would have made them intelligible was gone. And it left us here, 2,000 years later, still asking the questions that the Druids could have answered. What did the monument builders know? What did the astronomical alignments mean within the framework of the people who made them? What was the philosophy of the soul that made the warriors fearless and the legal tradition that made the community just? What did 20 years of training transmit? And what would it be worth to know? We will not fully recover those answers. The institution is gone, and the oral tradition that carried the knowledge is gone with it. But the asking of the questions is not futile. Every fragment we recover adds something. Every careful analysis of the archaeological record, the literary tradition, the place names, the folk practices, adds something. Every honest engagement with what the ancient sources actually say, stripped of the Roman rhetorical purpose that shaped them and the romantic overlay that later centuries added, adds something. The Druids terrified every civilization that came to Britain. They terrified Rome, which was the most powerful institutional state the ancient world had produced, not because they were primitive or irrational, but because they represented a coherent and sophisticated alternative to the Roman framework for understanding and organizing reality. They terrified the early church, which was building its new order on the ruins of the Roman one, not because they were evil, but because the Druidic framework for understanding the relationship between the human world and the divine world was different enough from the Christian one to constitute a genuine competitor. They terrified the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms building their new cultural order on top of the Romano-British substrate, not because there were still active Druids in the landscape, but because the cultural memory of what the Druids had represented persisted in forms that could not be entirely controlled or directed. And then they were gone. Not all at once, not cleanly, not in a single moment. They dispersed gradually, their knowledge fragmenting and dissolving into the larger cultural inheritance of the British Isles, their institutional structure replaced first by the Roman administrative apparatus, and then by the church, and then by the feudal order of the medieval period. Each transition took something more from the original tradition. Each generation that passed without institutional continuity lost something more of what the previous generation had held, until what remained was the echo of the echo of the echo of something that had once been as complete and as organized and as sophisticated as any tradition of knowledge that the ancient world produced. The stones are still here. The springs are still flowing. The place names are still speaking in the phonology of a dead language. The yew trees that were alive when the Druids performed their last ceremonies in the groves of Anglesey are still alive in the churchyards of Wales and England. The astronomical alignments built into the landscape by the tradition's predecessors still function every year at the solstices and equinoxes. The winter solstice comes again. The sun traces its lowest arc across the southern sky. The stones do what they were built to do, marking the moment when the solar year turns and the light begins its long return. The Druids are not there to mark it with us. They are gone, and the knowledge they carried is gone with them, and the civilization that feared them enough to destroy them utterly was right to recognize what it was destroying, because what it was destroying was not superstition but a different and genuine form of wisdom, organized in a form that could not survive the systematic assault of an imperial power determined to replace it with its own framework. The loss is permanent. The fragments remain. And the question of what the Druids actually knew and what it would mean to understand it properly is still open, still worth asking, still pointing towards something at the edge of what we can recover that might be more important than anything we have found so far. The stones remember. We are still learning to ask them the right questions. If this has been the kind of slow, patient exploration that helps you fall asleep, thinking about something real, something that matters, something that the world forgot before we were born to remember it, then that is exactly why these stories exist. The Druids vanished without a trace, except for all the traces they left behind that we are still learning to read. If you are somewhere in the world right now, drifting towards sleep with the image of the sacred grove in your mind, or the sound of the wind in an ancient yew tree, or the idea of a tradition so deep it took 20 years just to begin to transmit it, then you are keeping company with something that deserves to be kept company with. You can subscribe if you want more nights like this one, and you can let me know in the comments where you are and what time it is there. That small geography of listeners, scattered across the present moment as the Druids were scattered across the landscape, is something. It is a different kind of continuity, but it is real. Good night. The deeper you look into the Druidic tradition, the more clearly you can see the outlines of what was organized beneath the surface of what the Roman sources describe. The ancient writers were not inventing a fiction. They were describing something real through a lens that distorted it in specific ways. Strip the distortions away, apply the comparative mythology and the archaeology and the later Celtic literary tradition as correctives, And what emerges is an institution of extraordinary sophistication that organized a complex civilization through a set of intellectual tools radically different from those that Rome used to organize its own. The Druidic institution was, at its core, an institution of memory. This is the thing that most requires understanding if you want to understand why the Druids were what they were and why their destruction mattered in the way it did. Memory, in the Druidic context, was not simply the retention of facts. It was the living transmission of a way of understanding the world, organized in forms that could be reproduced accurately across generations and applied intelligently to new situations. The 20 years of training that Caesar describes was 20 years of developing the capacity to hold and transmit a particular way of knowing, not simply a body of information. The distinction is important. Information can be written down, stored, accessed later. A way of knowing cannot be fully captured in a written text, because it involves habits of attention, forms of perception, orientations toward experience that are developed through practice and that require a living tradition to transmit. The meditative traditions of various cultures have understood this for millennia, that the knowledge of how to meditate cannot be fully transmitted through a written text, that the presence of a teacher who embodies the practice is necessary for the transmission to be complete. The Druidic institution was organized around exactly this principle, that the most important knowledge it maintained was a way of knowing the world that could only be transmitted through long apprenticeship with practitioners who had themselves received the transmission. What did this way of knowing consist in? The ancient sources give us fragments: the ability to read the natural world for signs, the capacity to interpret the relationship between celestial patterns and earthly events, the skill of maintaining legal and philosophical reasoning across complex cases involving many parties and many competing interests, the art of poetry in the technical Celtic sense, in which words were understood to have direct effects in the world rather than simply representing effects that occurred by other means, the practice of divination in its various forms, the knowledge of plants and their properties, the understanding of the soul and its continuity through time and through the apparently terminal transitions of death. These are not separate skills in the Druidic framework. They are aspects of a single orientation toward the world that holds them together. The person who can read the natural world for signs is using the same capacity as the person who can interpret the relationship between a king's moral condition and the health of his kingdom. The person who understands the soul's continuity through death is using the same capacity as the person who understands the legal meaning of obligations that extend across generations. The person who knows which plants can heal and which can kill is using the same capacity as the person who knows which words can honor and which can destroy. The capacity underlying all of these is the capacity to perceive relationships, to understand how things that appear separate are actually connected, to navigate the space between what appears to be the case and what is actually operating beneath the appearance. This capacity for perceiving relationship is the specific intellectual achievement that 20 years of Druidic training developed. It is not the same as the capacity for logical analysis that the Greek philosophical tradition developed, though it is equally sophisticated. It is not the same as the capacity for systematic observation that the Roman engineering and administrative tradition developed, though it requires as much discipline. It is a third form of intellectual capability, one that the Western tradition largely lost access to when the Druidic institution and the other institutions that maintained analogous traditions in other cultural contexts were destroyed or marginalized. The comparative mythology scholar Mircea Eliade, whose work on shamanism and archaic religious forms remains influential despite the considerable controversy his methods have generated, identified a form of knowledge that he called archaic ontology, an understanding of the world in which the sacred dimension of reality is not separate from the natural dimension, but is its deepest layer, accessible through specific practices and specific trained modes of attention. The Druidic tradition, while not identical to the shamanic traditions that Eliade's work focused on, operated on similar epistemological ground. It maintained the understanding that the world has a sacred dimension that is not merely subjective, that the practices for accessing that dimension are not merely ceremonial, and that the knowledge gained through those practices is real knowledge with real consequences for real life. The Roman framework, which separated the sacred from the natural and placed the sacred in a specific institutional domain managed by specific institutional specialists, who were separate from the philosophers and the lawyers and the engineers, was epistemologically alien to this understanding, not simply less sophisticated, different in its basic assumptions about what knowledge is and what reality consists in. The encounter between the Roman framework and the Druidic framework was not simply a political conflict, it was a conflict between two incompatible epistemologies, and the one that won was not the more accurate one. It was the one attached to the greater military power. The question of whether the Druidic epistemology was more accurate than the Roman one in any meaningful sense is one that the modern world is genuinely ill-equipped to answer, because the modern world is the product of the Roman victory and the epistemological tradition that followed from it. We do not have the Druidic tradition available as a functioning alternative against which the Roman tradition can be evaluated. We have only fragments, and evaluating a tradition by its fragments is like evaluating a building by the rubble after it has been demolished. You can tell something about the quality of the materials. You cannot tell whether the building was well designed. What you can say, looking at the world that the Roman epistemological tradition eventually produced, is that it has both extraordinary achievements and severe limitations. The achievements are the ones we have been taught to celebrate: the scientific method, the accumulated knowledge of the natural world's physical structure and laws, the technological capacity to transform that structure for human purposes, the formal legal systems that manage complex societies, the philosophical traditions that have explored the structure of human thought and its relationship to reality. These are genuine achievements of the first order, and they are not trivial. The limitations are the ones we are less accustomed to naming clearly: the systematic inability to manage the relationship between human activity and the natural world sustainably, the difficulty of integrating ethical reasoning with scientific knowledge and practical governance in ways that produce consistently good outcomes, the fragmentation of human life into separate domains, professional, personal, spiritual, intellectual, that resist integration, and that produce individuals who are competent in their specific domain but disoriented in their life as a whole. These limitations are structural. They follow from the epistemological choices that the Roman tradition made. They are not simply failures of application, they are consequences of the framework. The Druidic tradition, as we can glimpse it through the fragments, was built around a different set of choices that produced different strengths and different limitations. The strength was integration. The integration of knowledge about the natural world with knowledge about human society, with knowledge about the divine dimensions of reality, held together by trained practitioners who understood the relationships between these domains as aspects of a single system. The limitation was scale. The 20-year training requirement meant that the number of people who could maintain the tradition at its highest level was always relatively small, and the tradition was therefore vulnerable to the kind of targeted destruction that Rome conducted. A tradition that requires 20 years to transmit cannot quickly replace practitioners who are killed. Rome understood this and acted on it. The vulnerability of the oral tradition is the specific design flaw, if we can call it that made the Druidic destruction as complete as it was. Written traditions can survive the death of their practitioners because the texts survive. Oral traditions cannot. When the practitioners are gone, the tradition is gone with them. This is why the burning of the Alexandrian library, which destroyed written texts, is mourned as a cultural catastrophe, because the texts were the tradition, and their destruction was the tradition's destruction. The Druidic equivalent happened without a library, without any physical repository of the tradition that could be burned. The tradition existed only in the trained memories of living practitioners, and when those practitioners were killed or dispersed and prevented from training successors, the tradition ended. The sophistication that made the Druidic tradition so formidable was also what made it so fragile. A tradition that requires 20 years to transmit, that cannot be written down, that depends on the maintained authority of specific recognized practitioners for its social function, is a tradition that can be destroyed in less than a generation if the practitioners are systematically eliminated and the training is prohibited. Rome recognized this and exploited it with military efficiency. The Anglesey campaign was the decisive blow. The legislative prohibitions that preceded it had already begun the work of delegitimizing the practitioners who remained. By the time Paulinus burned the groves, the tradition had already been weakened by decades of suppression in the parts of Britain under Roman control. Anglesey was the last stronghold, and its destruction completed the project. The question of what the Druids knew about their own tradition's vulnerability is one that cannot be answered directly, but the Irish material suggests that there was awareness, in the Celtic world generally, of the danger posed by the loss of knowledge keepers. The Irish law texts contain provisions about the obligations owed to the Fillid precisely because the knowledge they maintained was understood to be irreplaceable. The concept of the poet's satire as a legal sanction was itself a form of institutional protection, ensuring that the knowledge keeper could not be harmed without catastrophic social consequences for the harmer. The elaborate system of protections for the knowledge class in Celtic society was built around the recognition that the loss of a single, fully trained practitioner was a cultural catastrophe that could not be simply made good by the training of a replacement, because the training took 20 years. The Druids in Britain may have understood that Rome's campaign was existential in a specific sense, that it was not simply an attack on their institutional power, but an attempt to sever the transmission chain, to create a gap in the tradition that could not be bridged. The retreat to Anglesey, the gathering of the tradition in a single defensible location, may have been a strategic response to that recognition, an attempt to concentrate the practitioners and the knowledge in a place that could be protected, that could maintain the training, that could preserve the transmission even as Roman power consolidated elsewhere. If so, it was a reasonable strategy that failed because the concentration itself made the tradition vulnerable to a single, decisive military action. The alternative strategy, the one that actually partially worked, was the Irish one. Maintaining the tradition in a place that Rome could not reach, dispersing the knowledge across the Atlantic fringe, allowing it to survive in attenuated form through the Christian period, and eventually to be partially recovered in the written texts of the early medieval period. This was not a deliberate choice made at the moment of the Roman conquest. It was the outcome of geography and circumstance. Ireland's inaccessibility to Roman power was not engineered by the Druids. It was simply the condition that allowed the tradition to survive there in a form that Britain could not preserve. The relationship between the Druids and the Atlantic world is one of the most interesting and least explored aspects of the tradition. The Atlantic coast of Europe, from Brittany through Cornwall and Wales and Ireland to western Scotland, was a single cultural zone long before the Roman period. The megalithic tradition that produced Newgrange in Ireland and Carnac in Brittany and the great stone circles of Britain was an Atlantic tradition, spreading along the seaways that connected the Western European coast rather than the overland routes that later connected the continental interior. The Druids, who operated in the late Iron Age, were the heirs of this Atlantic cultural tradition, and their connection to the sea routes of the Atlantic world may have been more important than the ancient sources suggest. The presence of Druidic learning in Britain, as a destination for students from Gaul, which Caesar mentions explicitly, implies a connection between Britain and Gaul that was organized and sustained across the Channel. The mechanism for that connection was the Atlantic Seaway. The same coastal routes that had moved megalithic culture from Iberia to Scandinavia in the Neolithic period continued to move people and ideas in the Iron Age, and the Druidic institution was embedded in this network. The relative isolation of Britain from the continental interior, which made it the center of the most conservative and rigorous form of the tradition, was also what made it the natural destination for the student making the maximum commitment to the learning. You went to the edge of the world to find the deepest knowledge. The Welsh and Irish coastal traditions of the early medieval period, the monastic communities established on island sites, the hermits on the extreme western edges of the Atlantic fringe, may carry traces of this understanding. The tradition of the hermit on the island at the edge of the world, seeking knowledge that the mainland cannot provide, is a Christian elaboration of an older concept. The island at the edge of the world was not simply a place to escape from distraction. It was a place where the boundary between the ordinary world and the world beyond it was especially thin, where the knowledge that came from crossing that boundary was especially accessible. The early Irish monks who established communities on the Skellig Rocks, on the tiny islands off the western Irish coast, in the extreme northwestern reaches of Scotland, were operating in a cultural landscape that understood those edge places as specially significant long before Christianity arrived to give them a new institutional framework. The continuity between the pre-Christian understanding of the Western Edge as a place of access to deeper knowledge and the Christian practice of establishing monasteries and hermitages at the Western extreme is not accidental. It reflects the persistence of a cultural geography that the Druidic tradition had organized and that subsequent institutional changes could reshape but not entirely replace. The place was still the place. The understanding of why the place mattered changed its institutional framework several times over the millennium following the Roman conquest. But the place itself maintained its significance because the understanding of why it was significant was embedded in the landscape and the cultural memory of the people who inhabited it, not only in the institution that had once formally managed that significance. The study of what the Druids understood about the deep structure of the natural world has been advanced in recent decades by scholars who approach the Celtic mythological material with the tools of comparative mythology and the results of archaeology and archaeoastronomy. The work of scholars like Caitlin and John Matthews, Anne Ross, Alexei Kondratiev, and others working at the intersection of Celtic studies and the history of religion has progressively revealed a more complex picture than either the Romantic tradition or the dismissive mainstream allowed. The mythological cosmology that emerges from careful analysis of the later Celtic material is sophisticated in ways that the fragmentary nature of the sources tends to conceal from casual reading. The structure of the Celtic otherworld, for example, when analysed across the full range of its appearances in Irish and Welsh mythological material, reveals a consistent geography that is not simply fantastic invention, but is organised around specific cosmological principles. The otherworld is not simply a place where things are better than in the ordinary world, though the association with abundance and deathlessness is consistent. It is a place organised differently in terms of time, of social structure, of the relationship between beauty and power, of the scale at which things operate. Entry to it is possible, but governed by specific conditions. Return from it is possible, but transforms the returnee in specific ways. The knowledge available there is real knowledge that can be applied in the ordinary world, but only by someone who knows how to use it properly. This structure, when compared to the descriptions of altered states of consciousness that appear in traditions across the world that have maintained sophisticated practices for accessing such states, shows remarkable consistency with what trained practitioners in those traditions describe. The other world of Celtic mythology is not the realm of the dead in the Greek or Roman sense. It is the domain of a different order of consciousness, accessible through specific practices, organized according to its own consistent principles. The Druids, who had been trained in the practices for accessing this domain and trained in the framework for interpreting and applying what was found there, were engaged in something that has genuine epistemological substance, not simply in ceremonial performance. The specific practices used to access the otherworld in the Druidic tradition are almost entirely lost. The Tarb Heis Heis, the bull feast divination ceremony, described in Irish sources, in which a practitioner ate the flesh and drank the broth of a bull, then slept while 4 other practitioners sang a truth incantation over him, and then dreamed of the person who should be the next king, is one of the most vivid, specific ritual descriptions in the later Celtic material. It is clearly a formal procedure, with specific steps and specific participants, and a specific expected outcome. Whether it represents an actual ancient practice or a literary construction is debated, but its presence in the material and the detail with which it is described suggests that it preserves at least the outline of a genuine procedure for accessing the kind of knowledge that formal divination sought to produce. The Imbaz Forosnai, the enlightenment of great illumination, described in Irish sources as a specifically Philid class technique for accessing prophetic knowledge, is another example. The procedure involved chewing on a piece of raw meat from a pig, a dog, or a cat, then sleeping with hands placed on the cheeks, then receiving an answer to a question in a dream or vision. The specificity of the material and the procedure, the combination of a psychoactive or biochemically significant food with a specific physical position and a specific cognitive intention, suggests something more than literary invention. Whether the meat of these specific animals had any actual pharmacological significance, whether the physical position facilitated a specific neurological state, whether the combination of the two with focused intention reliably produced the claimed result, are questions that cannot now be answered. But the tradition that maintained this procedure did so with institutional seriousness, And the institutionally serious maintenance of a specific procedure implies that the procedure was understood to produce reliable results in the hands of trained practitioners. The concept of the truth incantation, the sung truth that could open a state of consciousness in which prophetic knowledge was accessible, connects the Druidic practices to the broader Indo-European tradition of the sacred power of rightly formed language. The Sanskrit concept of mantra, the Greek concept of epidos, the Latin carmen, the Old Irish imb, and the related terms for sacred speech in the Celtic traditions all point toward a shared understanding that language, in its most formally organized forms, has properties that go beyond its communicative function, that the right words spoken in the right way by the right person in the right context produce effects that are real, not merely psychological. The Druids were the specialists in this understanding within the Celtic world. The specific procedures they used are lost. The understanding that such procedures were real and required training to use correctly is preserved in fragments across the tradition. The Druidic understanding of what we would call consciousness is another area where the fragments suggest something sophisticated. The doctrine of the soul's transmigration, which Caesar attributes to the Druids and connects to military courage, was not simply a folk belief about life after death. It was embedded in a larger understanding of what consciousness is and how it relates to the physical world. The soul that transmigrates is not simply a self that moves from one body to another. It is something more like a stream of consciousness that takes successive forms, accumulating experience and wisdom through each passage, working towards something that the tradition understood in terms that we cannot now fully reconstruct, but that appear to involve the progressive refinement of the soul's relationship to the larger reality of which it is part. This is a sophisticated philosophical position, not a simple consolation about the afterlife. It implies a theory of personal identity that distinguishes between the specific form a consciousness takes in a particular lifetime and the deeper stream of consciousness that persists through multiple lifetimes. It implies a theory of knowledge that recognizes that some forms of understanding can only be developed over longer timescales than a single human lifetime allows, and that the soul's successive passages through different forms of existence are the mechanism by which this longer duration development occurs. It implies an ethics oriented toward the long term, in which actions have consequences not only for the present life, but for the character of the soul that will enter the next form of existence. The Druidic philosophical tradition, in the fragments we can access, was working out the implications of this understanding with sophistication. The Irish mythological material contains figures who are clearly understood to be souls that have passed through multiple existences, accumulating wisdom that exceeds what any single lifetime could produce. Tuan Mac Cairill in the Irish tradition is an example, a figure who has lived through the full history of Ireland in successive forms, as a man, then as a stag, then as a boar, then as an eagle, then as a salmon, before finally being reborn as a man again and possessing the accumulated memory of all his previous existences. This figure is not simply a mythological curiosity, it is a literary exploration of a philosophical position about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to time. The salmon, specifically, appears repeatedly in the Celtic tradition as the repository of the deepest accumulated wisdom. The salmon of knowledge in Irish mythology, which has eaten the hazelnuts that have fallen into the pool of wisdom from the sacred hazel trees surrounding it, contains within itself the accumulated knowledge of the world, accessible to anyone who eats of its flesh. This is not simply a pretty story. It is an encoded philosophical position about the nature of wisdom, that it accumulates across vast timescales, that it is available to those who know how to access it, that the access requires specific procedures and the assistance of a specialist who understands those procedures. The Druidic tradition was the institution that maintained the understanding of those procedures and the authority to use them. The hazel and the salmon are both specifically Atlantic Celtic images. The hazel grows along the Atlantic fringe of Europe. The salmon returns from the ocean to the rivers of Britain and Ireland in its annual cycle, embodying in its physical journey the same principle of return that the Druidic doctrine of the soul's transmigration described in philosophical terms. The connection between the Atlantic world's ecology and the Druidic philosophical tradition is not accidental. The tradition was shaped by the specific natural world within which it developed and the specific natural world of the Atlantic Celtic zone, with its salmon rivers and its hazel groves and its long Atlantic horizons pointing toward the otherworld direction, shape the tradition in specific ways that distinguish it from the continental Celtic tradition and that mark it as specifically and distinctively British and Irish. The islands of the West, the Hebrides, the Aran Islands, the Faroe Islands beyond, the mythological islands like Hy-Brasil and Tir na Nog, were real destinations of real voyages in the Atlantic Celtic tradition. The Irish Imrama, the voyage stories that describe expeditions to the Western Islands and to the otherworld beyond them, are literary descendants of a genuine Atlantic voyaging tradition that was active in the pre-Christian period. The navigational knowledge required to voyage in the Atlantic, out of sight of land, was real knowledge, maintained by real specialists, who understood the patterns of the ocean and the sky in ways that modern researchers are only beginning to fully appreciate through the study of the recorded navigational knowledge of later Atlantic peoples. The Druids, who maintained the cosmological framework in which the Western Ocean was the threshold of the otherworld, were also, very likely, the people who maintained the navigational knowledge that made voyaging in that direction possible. The connection between sacred geography and practical navigation is another example of the integration that characterized the Druidic tradition. The understanding of the Western Islands as places where the boundary between the ordinary world and the otherworld was thin was not simply mythological. It was also navigational, in the sense that it encoded in cultural form the understanding of what kinds of environments lay at the western edge of the known world. The isolated island at the edge of the ocean, beyond the ordinary reach of human communities, where conditions were extreme and the encounter with the non-human world was unavoidable, was both a real geographical location and a sacred location where the deeper dimensions of reality were accessible. Managing the cultural knowledge of these places required both the navigational knowledge to find them and the philosophical knowledge to understand what was found there. This is the tradition that was lost, not simply the ceremonies, not simply the specific ritual procedures. The integrated knowledge of the natural world and the sacred world and the human world, held together by trained practitioners who understood all three as aspects of a single reality and who managed the relationships between them with institutional seriousness across multiple dimensions simultaneously. This is what 20 years of training produced, and this is what was gone when the training was prohibited and the groves were burned and the practitioners were scattered or killed. The British Isles after the Roman conquest were a different kind of place from what they had been before, not worse in every respect. The Romans brought genuine goods, infrastructure, urban amenities, expanded trade networks, the benefits of integration into a larger economic and cultural system. But they also brought the loss of the integrated knowledge tradition that had organized the relationship between the human community and the landscape it inhabited. The sacred springs became spas. The Nemeton became a building site or a ruin. The astronomical alignments in the monument landscape continued to function, but the institutional knowledge of what they were saying fell silent. The landscape was still full of signs. The institution that could read them was gone. The Romano-British period produced a civilization of considerable achievement and considerable sadness. Achievement in the sense of the urban centres, the roads, the villas, the arts and crafts that synthesized Celtic and Roman forms into something new. Sadness in the sense of the rural population, which maintained some shadow of the older cultural framework in folk practice and in the persistent attachment to the sacred places of the landscape, but which had lost the institution that had once made that attachment meaningful and organized in the fullest sense. The folk practice was the residue of the tradition without the tradition itself. The attachment to the sacred spring was real but unorganized, without the trained specialist who could engage with the spring in the full depth of the tradition's understanding. The post-Roman period, when Roman administration collapsed and Britain was left to find its own way, produced the conditions in which what remained of the older cultural framework could resurface in partial forms. The development of the Arthurian legend, which began in the post-Roman period as a set of stories about the resistance to the Saxon invasion, incorporated elements that look Druidic in origin. The wizard advisor, the sacred landscape, the kingship, grounded in a specific relationship to the land, rather than in descent or military power alone. The sword from the stone, or the lake, connecting the king's authority to the powers of the earth and the water. These are not simply literary conventions borrowed from classical tradition. They are the residue of the Celtic political philosophy that the Druidic institution had once organized and maintained. The Merlin figure, however transformed and however filtered through the literary conventions of the 12th century in Geoffrey of Monmouth's treatment, preserves the structural role of the Druidic advisor to the king, the figure who knows what the land requires and what the cosmos demands, who operates outside the ordinary political structures but whose knowledge shapes them. Merlin's prophecies, which became one of the most widely read texts of medieval Europe and which continued to be read as genuine political prophecy into the early modern period, are a literary ghost of the Druidic prophetic tradition. They are not Druidic texts, they are medieval constructions, but the cultural space they occupy, the cultural need they address, is the same space that the Druids once occupied and the same need that Druidic prophecy once addressed. The institution was gone, the need remained. The Welsh bards who maintained their tradition in the courts of the medieval Welsh princes were not Druids, but the tradition they maintained, with its elaborate formal requirements, its specialized vocabulary, its 12-year training program, its specific social status and privileges, its capacity to make and unmake reputations through the power of formally organized language, was structurally continuous with the bardic class that had been part of the larger Druidic institution in the pre-Roman period. The content was different. The institutional framework was different. The specific powers claimed were different. But the underlying understanding of what formally organized language could do and of the social function of the trained specialist in language as a figure who stood between the ordinary world and the forces that shaped it was continuous. The Eisteddfod tradition, which maintained the Welsh bardic competition into the modern period and which was revived in the 18th century in forms that drew on the same romantic impulse that produced the Druidic associations with Stonehenge, is, in its modern form, a cultural institution rather than an institution that claims the specific powers of the old bardic tradition. But it maintains the understanding that formally organized language in the traditional form is worth the investment of a community's sustained attention and support. It maintains the understanding that the people who can use that language at the highest level of formal organization possess something worth honoring publicly. This is a distant but genuine echo of the understanding that the Druids embodied and transmitted. The question of what the Druids thought about time is the last major dimension of the tradition that deserves attention, because it is the one that most directly addresses the question of why they terrified every civilization that encountered them. The Roman understanding of time was primarily linear. History moved in a single direction, from the past through the present into the future, and the goal of historical action was to move the future in a desired direction through intelligent planning and effective execution. The Druidic understanding of time was primarily cyclical. The great cycles of the year, the life cycle of the soul through multiple existences, the larger cosmic cycles that the astronomical tradition tracked, all organized time as repetition, as the return of patterns that had operated before and would operate again. This is not simply the observation that seasons repeat or that the sun rises every morning. It is a philosophical position about the nature of reality, which holds that the patterns that organize existence are eternal, that what has happened will happen again, that the deepest form of knowledge is the knowledge of what the patterns are and how to navigate them. The astronomical knowledge that the Druids maintained was knowledge of these patterns in their astronomical form. The legal knowledge was knowledge of these patterns in their social form. The knowledge of the soul's transmigration was knowledge of these patterns in their psychological and philosophical form. The ceremonial knowledge was knowledge of how to engage with these patterns in ways that maintained the proper relationship between the human community and the larger reality of which it was part. This understanding made the Druids genuinely difficult for Rome to manage, because Rome's strategies for managing subject peoples were based on the assumption that time moved in one direction and that the direction of movement could be controlled by the right application of power and administration. The Druids understood time as something that moved in cycles, and in the Druidic understanding, what Rome was doing was not controlling the direction of history but disrupting a pattern that would eventually reassert itself. The Druidic doctrine of the soul's immortality was not simply comfort for the dying warrior. It was a claim about what was actually real and what was merely apparent, and in the Druidic framework, Roman power was merely apparent. The pattern beneath it was what was real, and the pattern would return. This is the specific form of the terror that the Druids inspired. not the terror of a military threat. Rome could manage military threats, not the terror of an alien religion. Rome was quite capable of absorbing alien religions. The terror of a coherent philosophical tradition that understood what Rome was doing as a temporary disruption of a pattern too deep to be permanently altered. A tradition that told the population it governed that the conqueror's victory was not final, that what appeared to be the collapse of the old order was actually a phase in a larger cycle, that the dead warriors were not gone, but were part of a continuity that Rome could not interrupt. This was not superstition. This was a sophisticated political theology, and it was devastatingly effective at maintaining the will to resist in ways that Roman administrative measures could not fully suppress. The decision to destroy the institution rather than absorb it was the only strategic option available. You could not absorb a tradition that held that your authority was temporary and illusory. You could not integrate an institution that understood your framework for legitimizing authority as fundamentally misguided. You had to eliminate it, and eliminate it so thoroughly that no trace remained that could serve as the nucleus of a revived resistance. Rome understood this and acted on it. The burning of the groves was not vandalism, it was strategy. And it was strategy informed by a genuine understanding of what the Druids represented and why they had to go. The tragedy of the British Isles after the Druids is the tragedy of a landscape that remembers something the people in it have forgotten how to read. The signs are still there. The stones are still oriented toward the solstice sky. The springs are still flowing from the places that the tradition understood as the points where the powers of the earth were most accessible. The place names are still speaking in the phonology of the language that the tradition was transmitted in. The ancient trees are still alive, older than any living person or any living institution, older than the Roman conquest, older than the Christianity that built its churchyards around them, alive through everything that happened and still happening. The Druids who stood on the shore of Anglesey as the Roman legions crossed toward them understood something that their conquerors did not fully understand. They understood that what they were was not simply an institution but a relationship between a people and their landscape and the powers that animated it. You could destroy the institution. You could not destroy the relationship. The landscape would remember. The signs would persist. The pattern would continue to operate beneath the surface of whatever was built on top of it. And someday, in some form, someone would look at the signs and begin again the work of understanding what they were saying. We are that someone. We are still beginning. The work is still incomplete. The signs are still there, still speaking, still patient. The stones are still aligned to the solstice sky. The springs are still flowing. The yews are still alive. And the tradition that understood all of it, that organized it and transmitted it and managed it with institutional seriousness for centuries, is still gone, still irretrievably absent in its original form, still leaving a space in our understanding of ourselves and our landscape that nothing has yet been found to adequately fill. This is the shape of the mystery. Not the mystery of what specifically the Druids did in the groves, though that is genuinely unknown. The mystery of what it means to lose the institution that maintained a civilization's relationship to its own deepest past, and to be left with the signs and the fragments and the persistent, the uncomfortable sense that something was here before us, that understood the landscape in ways we have not yet learned, and that the landscape is still waiting for us to remember how to hear it. The Druids terrified every civilization that came to Britain. They terrified them not with weapons but with knowledge, not with power but with understanding, not with military force but with a framework for making sense of the world that was coherent and sophisticated and completely incompatible with the frameworks that the conquering civilizations brought with them. They vanished without a trace, in the sense that the institution is gone, the oral tradition is gone, the specific philosophical and astronomical and legal content is gone. But they left traces everywhere, and the traces are still there, and the questions they raise are still the deepest questions. What did the builders of the monuments know? What did the keepers of the grove understand? What is the landscape still saying to anyone who has learned to listen? We are still learning. The Druids vanished. The questions they raised have not. The oak still stands. The spring still flows. The sky still turns in the patterns the Druids memorized. The traces remain in stone, in water, in silence. The questions they raised are still the very deepest this ancient landscape knows how to ask.